In the twilight of the 19th century, when the electric light was still a novelty and the horseless carriage a mere curiosity, one man dared to imagine a device that could traverse not space, but time itself. H.G. Wells, a visionary whose mind seemed to exist partially in our future, penned The Time Machine, a tale that would forever alter our perception of the fourth dimension. In this adaptation of the classic, The Time Machine is rewritten in the style of the iconic science fiction author Arthur C. Clarke.
As you embark on this auditory journey, prepare to be transported to a world where the boundaries of the present dissolve, revealing vistas of both wonder and terror. Wells' time traveler, unnamed yet unforgettable, will guide you through the corridors of millennia to an Earth transformed beyond recognition. This is not merely a flight of fancy, but a profound exploration of human nature and the potential consequences of our actions stretched across the canvas of time. Wells, with uncanny prescience, forces us to confront questions that still resonate in our age of rapid technological advancement and social change.
As you listen, consider, are we the masters of our destiny, or merely passengers on an inexorable journey to a predetermined end? What responsibility do we bear for the future we're creating with each passing moment? The Time Machine stands as a testament to the power of the human imagination and our enduring fascination with the unknown. It reminds us that while we may be bound to the present, our minds are free to roam the infinite possibilities of what may come. Prepare yourself for a voyage that will challenge your perceptions and ignite your sense of wonder. The future and the past await. If, as you listen, you find yourself enjoying this story, we invite you to please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. It is the best way to help others, like you, find our content.
Chapter 1. A Discourse on the Fourth Dimension. The warm glow of the fireplace cast dancing shadows across the richly appointed drawing room, where a small group of intellectuals had gathered for what promised to be an extraordinary evening. The air was thick with the lingering aroma of a sumptuous dinner, mingling with the peaty scent of aged scotch and the earthy tobacco smoke that curled lazily towards the ornate ceiling. In the center of this tableau sat the time traveler, his eyes glinting with barely contained excitement, as he leaned forward in his plush leather armchair. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice cutting through the comfortable silence that had settled over the room, "I believe it's time we addressed a fundamental misconception that has plagued our understanding of the universe for far too long." The assembled guests, a diverse group of scholars, scientists, and thinkers, shifted in their seats, their attention fully captured by the time traveler's opening gambit. Among them sat Philby, a red-haired, argumentative man with a sharp wit. The psychologist whose piercing gaze seemed to dissect every word uttered, and the medical man, his weathered hands clasped thoughtfully before him. "You see," the time traveler continued, gesturing expansively, "the geometry we've been taught since childhood, the very foundation upon which we've built our understanding of the physical world, is fundamentally flawed." A murmur of surprise rippled through the gathering. The psychologist raised an eyebrow, his skepticism evident in the set of his jaw. Undeterred, the time traveler pressed on. "Consider, if you will, the concept of a mathematical line. We're taught that it has length, but no breadth. And a mathematical plane? Length and breadth, but no thickness. These are mere abstractions, gentlemen, convenient fictions that have no true existence in reality." He paused, allowing his words to sink in. The firelight flickered across his features, casting deep shadows that seemed to emphasize the gravity of his statement. "In truth," he continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper that compelled his audience to lean in, "any real object must possess 4 dimensions, not just the 3 spatial dimensions we're accustomed to, length, breadth, and thickness, but a 4th dimension, duration." The medical man's brow furrowed. "Duration? You mean time?" "Precisely," the time traveler exclaimed, his eyes alight with enthusiasm. Time, gentlemen, is nothing more than a kind of space. Our consciousness moves along it, from the past towards the future, much as we might move through physical space. Philby scoffed, the sound sharp in the hushed room. Come now, surely you jest. Time as a dimension, it's preposterous. The time traveller smiled indulgently. Is it, my dear Philby? Consider this. We move freely through space, do we not? We can go left or right, forward or backward, up or down. Yet our movement through time seems constrained to a single direction, always forward, never back. But what if I told you that this limitation is merely a product of our perception, not an immutable law of the universe? He rose from his chair, pacing before the fireplace as he warmed to his topic. The assembled guests watched, transfixed, as he gesticulated passionately. Imagine, if you will, a weather map, he said. It shows the distribution of temperature and pressure by lines on a surface. In such a diagram, the vertical dimension might represent temperature and the horizontal time. The line traced by a moving finger on this map would represent the fluctuations of temperature as time progresses. But to the meteorologist, time is not a fourth dimension. The map is simply a convenient way of expressing the distribution of temperature on a plane surface. The psychologist leaned forward. His interest piqued despite his initial skepticism. But surely, time traveler, you're not suggesting that time is truly analogous to these spatial dimensions? That's precisely what I'm suggesting, the time traveler replied, his voice thrumming with conviction. The only difference is that our consciousness moves along the time dimension from the beginning to the end of our lives, and that this dimension is not open to our inspection. But consider this. At any given moment, what we call the present is merely the mental section we make across four-dimensional existence. He paused, allowing his gaze to sweep across the room, meeting each pair of eyes in turn. There is no difference between time and any of the three dimensions of space, except that our consciousness moves along it, he asserted. The medical man, who had been listening intently, spoke up. But if time is really only a fourth dimension of space, why is it, and why has it always been, regarded as something different? And why cannot we move in time as we move in the other dimensions of space? The time traveler's smile widened. Ah, now we come to the crux of the matter. You're perfectly right to ask that question. It's one that has puzzled philosophers and scientists for centuries. The answer, I believe, lies in the nature of our consciousness and the limitations of our current technology. He returned to his seat, leaning forward with an intensity that seemed to draw his audience in. We can remember the past, can we not? We can recall events from years ago with vivid clarity. In a sense, we are already moving through time, albeit in a limited fashion. But we cannot stay in the past. Our consciousness inevitably snaps back to the present. Similarly, we can imagine the future, but we cannot physically inhabit it. Yet. The room fell silent as the implications of his words sank in. Even Philby, for all his initial skepticism, seemed to be considering the possibility. But what if, the time traveler continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, we could develop a technology that would allow us to move through time as freely as we move through space? A machine that could traverse the fourth dimension at will? The psychologist chuckled nervously. Surely you're not suggesting— I am suggesting precisely that, the time traveler interrupted, his eyes gleaming. Gentlemen, I believe I have constructed such a device. A collective gasp echoed through the room. The medical man leaned forward, his face a mixture of disbelief and fascination. You can't be serious, he breathed. I assure you, I am entirely serious, the time traveler replied. But before I reveal my creation, let me explain the scientific principles that make it possible. He stood once more, moving to a nearby chalkboard that had been set up earlier in the evening. With quick, precise strokes, he began to sketch a series of diagrams. Consider Einstein's theory of special relativity, he began. It tells us that time and space are inextricably linked, two aspects of a single continuum called space-time. The faster an object moves through space, the slower it moves through time. This is not mere theory, gentlemen. It has been experimentally verified countless times. The chalk scratched against the board as he drew a simple diagram illustrating the concept. Now, if we could find a way to manipulate this relationship, to move through space in such a way that our movement through time is dramatically altered. We could, in effect, travel through time. Philby, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke up. But surely the energy requirements for such a feat would be astronomical. It's simply not feasible. The time traveler nodded approvingly. An excellent point, Philby. Indeed, using conventional means, the energy required would be beyond our current capabilities. But what if we could harness the energy of space-time itself? He turned back to the chalkboard, sketching a new diagram. Recent theoretical work in quantum mechanics suggests that empty space is not truly empty. It's a roiling sea of virtual particles, popping in and out of existence on timescales so brief we can barely detect them. These particles represent an enormous amount of energy, what physicists call zero-point energy. The medical man's eyes widened. Are you suggesting we could harness this energy? Precisely, the time traveler replied. My device incorporates a novel quantum field manipulator that allows us to tap into this vast sea of energy. By doing so, we can create localized distortions in the fabric of space-time itself. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room. The assembled guests were leaning forward, their expressions a mixture of fascination and disbelief. But that's not all, he continued. The real breakthrough came when I realized that these distortions could be shaped and controlled. By carefully manipulating the quantum fields, we can create what I call a temporal bubble, a region of space-time that can be moved along the time dimension independently of the surrounding universe. The psychologist shook his head slowly. It's incredible. If what you're saying is true, it would revolutionize our understanding of physics, of reality itself. Indeed it would, the time traveler agreed. But I assure you, gentlemen, this is no mere thought experiment. I have built such a device, and I have tested it. A hush fell over the room. Even the crackling of the fire seemed muted as the full import of his words sank in. Philby was the first to break the silence. Tested it? You mean to say you've actually traveled through time? The time traveler's eyes twinkled mischievously. Would you believe me if I said yes? Before anyone could respond, he continued, but perhaps it would be better if I showed you. If you'll indulge me for a moment, I'll fetch the device from my laboratory. As he rose to leave the room, the assembled guests exchanged glances of mingled excitement and skepticism. The psychologist leaned towards the medical man, whispering, surely this must be some elaborate hoax. The medical man shrugged, his expression thoughtful. I'm not so sure. The scientific principles he's described are sound if highly speculative. And you must admit, he's always been ahead of his time in his thinking. Philby, overhearing their exchange, snorted, ahead of his time indeed. If what he's saying is true, he might well be ahead of all our times. As they waited for the time traveler's return, a palpable sense of anticipation filled the room. Each man was lost in his own thoughts, contemplating the implications of what they had heard. If the time traveler's claims were true, they stood on the brink of a discovery that would alter the course of human history. The fire crackled softly, casting long shadows across the room. Outside, the night pressed against the windows, a reminder of the vast, mysterious universe that lay beyond. And in that moment, as they waited with bated breath for the time traveler's return, each man felt a profound sense of wonder, a glimpse of the infinite possibilities that lay hidden within the fabric of space-time itself. Little did they know that their understanding of reality was about to be irrevocably changed, and that they were about to embark on an adventure that would challenge everything they thought they knew about the nature of time and space. The door creaked open, and the time traveler reappeared, carrying a strange, intricate device. It was roughly the size of a small end table, a gleaming construct of brass, nickel, and quartz. Delicate gears and crystalline structures were visible beneath a transparent casing, pulsing with an otherworldly light that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. As he set the device down on a nearby table, the assembled guests leaned forward, their eyes wide with a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. The machine hummed softly, emitting a barely perceptible vibration that seemed to resonate with the very air around it. "Gentlemen," the time traveler announced, his voice trembling slightly with barely contained excitement, I present to you the culmination of my life's work, a machine capable of traversing the fourth dimension. Philby was the first to break the stunned silence. It's remarkable, he admitted, his earlier skepticism giving way to grudging admiration. But how does it work? The time traveler's eyes lit up at the question. Ah, my dear Philby, I'm delighted you asked. Allow me to explain the fundamental principles behind its operation. He gestured to the machine, his hands moving with the practiced ease of a man intimately familiar with every component. At its core, the device utilizes a novel application of quantum field theory. You see, the fabric of space-time itself is not the smooth continuum we once believed it to be. At the quantum level, it's a roiling sea of virtual particles, popping in and out of existence on timescales so brief we can barely detect them. The psychologist leaned forward, his brow furrowed in concentration. But how does this relate to time travel? An excellent question, the time traveler replied. You see, these virtual particles represent an enormous amount of energy, what physicists call zero-point energy. My device incorporates a quantum field manipulator that allows us to tap into this vast sea of energy, creating localized distortions in the fabric of space-time itself. He pointed to a series of crystalline structures within the machine. These structures are composed of a novel material I've developed, a form of metamaterial that exhibits negative refractive properties when exposed to specific electromagnetic frequencies. When activated, they create what I call a temporal bubble, a region of space-time that can be moved along the time dimension independently of the surrounding universe. The medical man shook his head in amazement. It's incredible, but surely the energy requirements for such a feat would be astronomical. The time traveler nodded approvingly. Indeed, they would be, using conventional means. But by harnessing the zero-point energy of the quantum vacuum, we can achieve the necessary power output without the need for external energy sources. He paused, allowing his gaze to sweep across the room. The assembled guests were hanging on his every word, their expressions a mixture of awe and disbelief. But perhaps, he continued, a mischievous glint in his eye, a demonstration would be more convincing than any explanation I could offer. With that, he reached out and grasped a lever on the side of the machine. The humming intensified, and the pulsing light within the device grew brighter, casting strange, shifting shadows across the room. Gentlemen, I invite you to observe closely, the time traveler said, his voice barely audible above the machine's growing whine. What you are about to witness may challenge everything you believe about the nature of reality. With a decisive motion, he pulled the lever. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. Then suddenly, the air around the machine began to shimmer, as if viewed through a heat haze. The very fabric of space seemed to twist and distort, creating a spherical region of warped reality centered on the device. The guests gasped in unison, instinctively stepping back. Philby, his face pale, reached out a tentative hand towards the distortion. I wouldn't do that if I were you, the time traveler warned, a note of urgency in his voice. The temporal field is highly unstable. Any interaction could have unpredictable consequences. As they watched, transfixed, the distortion began to pulse rhythmically. With each pulse, the time traveler's form seemed to blur slightly, as if viewed through a rapidly spinning prism. What you're seeing, he explained, his voice echoing strangely, is the effect of my consciousness beginning to decouple from your temporal frame of reference. In a few moments, I will vanish from your perception entirely as I move along the time dimension at a rate far exceeding your own. The psychologist, his scientific curiosity overcoming his initial shock, leaned forward. But where, or should I say when, will you go? The time traveler smiled enigmatically. That, my dear friend, is the true wonder of this device. I can navigate the time stream much as a ship navigates the ocean. I could visit the distant past, witnessing the birth of stars and the formation of galaxies. Or I could venture into the far future, observing the ultimate fate of our universe. His expression grew more serious. But such journeys are not without risk. The further one travels from one's native time frame, the greater the danger of temporal paradoxes and unforeseen consequences. As if to emphasize his point, The machine's humming suddenly increased in pitch, and sparks of energy began to crackle across its surface. The time traveler's form flickered more rapidly, becoming increasingly translucent. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice growing faint, "I fear our time together draws to a close. But fear not, I shall return with tales of wonders beyond imagining." With a final, brilliant flash of light, both the time traveler and the machine vanished, leaving behind only a faint smell of ozone and a room full of stunned observers. For several long moments, no one spoke. The tick of the mantel clock seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. Finally, the medical man cleared his throat. "Well," he said, his voice shaky, "I suppose that settles the question of whether he was serious about his claims." Philby, still staring at the spot where the time traveler had stood, shook his head slowly. I can scarcely believe what I've just witnessed. If this is some sort of trick or illusion, it's beyond anything I've ever encountered." The psychologist, always the most analytical of the group, had already pulled out a notebook and was scribbling furiously. "We must document everything we've seen and heard," he insisted. "This could revolutionize our understanding of physics, of the nature of time itself." As the initial shock began to wear off, the room erupted into a cacophony of excited discussion. Theories were proposed and debated, each man trying to reconcile what they had witnessed with their understanding of the universe. Hours passed, and still the time traveler did not return. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows, the guests reluctantly prepared to depart, their minds still reeling from the night's events. "What do we do now?" Philby asked as they gathered their coats. "Should we alert the authorities? The scientific community?" The medical man shook his head. "Who would believe us? Without proof, we'd be laughed out of every respectable institution in the country." "No," the psychologist agreed. "Our best course of action is to wait. The time traveler promised he would return. Until then, we must keep this to ourselves." As they filed out into the crisp morning air, each man felt profoundly changed by what they had witnessed. The world seemed somehow larger, more mysterious, and infinitely more wondrous than it had just hours before. Days passed, then weeks, with no sign of the time traveler's return. His house stood empty, a silent testament to the extraordinary events of that fateful night. The small group of witnesses met regularly, discussing and debating what they had seen, each grappling in their own way with the implications of time travel. It was on a blustery autumn evening, nearly a month after the time traveler's disappearance, that they received word. A telegram arrived at each of their homes, bearing the same cryptic message: "Return imminent. Gather at the house. Prepare for wonders." With a mixture of excitement and trepidation, they hurried to the time traveler's residence. The house was just as they had left it that night, the drawing room still bearing the faint scent of tobacco and whiskey. As they settled into their familiar seats, a strange tension filled the air. The mantel clock ticked away the seconds, each moment pregnant with anticipation. Suddenly, without warning, the air in the center of the room began to shimmer and distort. A high-pitched whine filled their ears, building to an almost unbearable intensity. Then, with a blinding flash of light and a thunderous crack, the time traveler materialized before them. But he was changed. His clothes were tattered and scorched, his face haggard and lined with exhaustion. His eyes, however, burned with an intensity that spoke of wonders beyond imagining. "Gentlemen," he gasped, stumbling slightly as he stepped forward, "you cannot conceive of the marvels I have witnessed, the terrors I have faced." They rushed to his side, helping him to a chair. As the psychologist poured him a stiff drink, the others peppered him with questions. "Where have you been? What did you see? How long were you gone?" The time traveler held up a hand, silencing their inquiries. He took a long sip of his drink, his hand trembling slightly. "I have journeyed to the very end of time," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I have seen the death of our sun, the evolution of humanity into forms beyond our comprehension, and the ultimate fate of our universe." His audience leaned in, captivated by his words. "But more than that," he continued, his eyes taking on a faraway look, "I have learned that time is far more complex, far more malleable than we ever imagined. The future is not fixed, gentlemen. Our actions, our choices, ripple through the time stream in ways we can scarcely comprehend. He paused, his expression growing grave. And I have learned that we are not alone in our mastery of time. There are others, beings of unimaginable power and incomprehensible motives who move through the fourth dimension as easily as we move through the other three. A chill ran through the room at his words. The implications were staggering, hinting at a universe far stranger and more perilous than they had ever imagined. But come, the time traveler said, struggling to his feet. There is much to discuss, and time, ironically enough, is of the essence. The knowledge I have gained must be shared, for the fate of humanity itself may hang in the balance. As they gathered around him, each man felt the weight of history upon their shoulders. They stood at the threshold of a new era, one in which the very nature of time and space would be rewritten. The adventures that lay ahead would challenge their understanding of reality, test the limits of their courage, and ultimately perhaps determine the destiny of their entire species. The time traveler smiled, a glint of excitement breaking through his exhaustion. "Gentlemen," he said, "our journey has only just begun." Chapter 2: The Luminous Model. The drawing room of the time traveler's Victorian mansion was awash in the warm, flickering glow of gaslight and the crackling flames from the hearth. Outside, the night pressed against the windows, a vast star-speckled canvas that seemed to hint at the infinite mysteries of the cosmos. Inside, a group of distinguished gentlemen gathered around their host, their faces a mixture of curiosity, skepticism, and barely concealed excitement. The time traveler, a man of middling years with piercing eyes that glinted with an inner fire of genius, stood before his guests. His fingers, long and dexterous, caressed a small object hidden beneath a velvet cloth. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying the weight of one about to unveil a profound secret, "what I am about to show you may challenge everything you believe about the nature of our universe." With a flourish, he whipped away the cloth, revealing a small, exquisitely crafted model that immediately drew gasps of admiration from his audience. It was a miniature machine, no larger than a mantel clock, yet possessed of an otherworldly beauty that hinted at its extraordinary purpose. The device was a symphony of materials and craftsmanship. Its frame was fashioned from a lustrous metal that seemed to shimmer with an inner light, catching and refracting the room's illumination in mesmerizing patterns. Delicate ivory inlays traced intricate geometrical patterns across its surface, forming shapes that seemed to shift and change as one's gaze lingered upon them. At its heart, a crystalline structure pulsed with a soft, ethereal glow, as if it housed a captive star. "Behold," the time traveler announced, his voice thrumming with barely contained excitement, "a model of my time machine." Philby, a red-haired, argumentative man, leaned forward, his skepticism evident in the set of his jaw. "Time machine? Surely you jest, old friend. Such a thing is impossible." The time traveler's eyes twinkled with amusement. "Ah, Philby, how quick we are to pronounce upon the possible and impossible. Let us remember that our understanding of the universe is ever evolving. What seems impossible today may be commonplace tomorrow." He gestured to the model, inviting his guests to examine it more closely. "This device," he explained, "is designed to traverse what I believe to be the fourth dimension, time itself." The psychologist, a man of keen intellect and measured skepticism, peered at the machine through his pince-nez. "Fascinating," he murmured, "but how does it work?" The time traveler's face lit up at the question. "Ah, the crux of the matter. You see, gentlemen, time is not the rigid, unidirectional flow we perceive it to be. Einstein's theory of relativity has shown us that time is malleable, affected by gravity and velocity. My machine exploits this malleability." He pointed to the crystalline structure at the machine's core. "This is a novel form of quartz, grown under extreme pressures and subjected to precise electromagnetic fields. When activated, it creates what I call a temporal bubble, a localized region where the flow of time can be manipulated." The medical man, his weathered hands clasped before him, furrowed his brow. "But surely the energy requirements for such a feat would be astronomical." "An excellent observation," the time traveler nodded approvingly. Indeed, using conventional energy sources, it would be impossible. But this machine taps into the very fabric of space-time itself, the quantum foam that underlies all of reality. He gestured to the intricate patterns on the machine's surface. These circuits are fashioned from a superconductive metamaterial of my own design. When activated, they create a cascading quantum effect that harvests zero-point energy from the vacuum of space itself. The room fell silent as the implications of his words sank in. Even Philby, for all his skepticism, seemed momentarily at a loss for words. The time traveler allowed himself a small smile before continuing. But perhaps a demonstration would be more convincing than any explanation I could offer. Would one of you care to assist me? After a moment's hesitation, the psychologist stepped forward. I would be honored, he said, a mixture of excitement and trepidation in his voice. Excellent, the time traveler beamed. He guided the psychologist's hand to a small lever on the side of the machine. Now, when you're ready, simply push this lever forward. This will activate the temporal field and send the machine on its journey through time. The assembled guests held their collective breath as the psychologist's fingers closed around the lever. With a nervous glance at the time traveler, who nodded encouragingly, he pushed it forward. For a heartbeat, nothing seemed to happen. Then, suddenly, the crystalline core of the machine flared with an intense, otherworldly light. The air around the device began to shimmer and distort, as if reality itself was being warped by its presence. And then, in the blink of an eye, the machine vanished. A stunned silence fell over the room, broken only by the soft ticking of the mantel clock and the crackling of the fire. The table where the machine had stood was now empty, save for a faint, shimmering distortion in the air that quickly faded away. Philby was the first to find his voice. Good God, he breathed, his earlier skepticism forgotten in the face of what he had just witnessed. It's gone. The medical man, his scientific curiosity overcoming his initial shock, leaned in to examine the spot where the machine had been. Remarkable, he murmured. There's no sign of it at all. No scorch marks, no residual energy signature. It's as if it simply ceased to exist in our time frame. The time traveler nodded, a look of satisfaction on his face. Not ceased to exist, my dear doctor, but rather moved beyond our perception. The machine has embarked on a journey through the fourth dimension, traversing time as easily as we might cross a room. The psychologist, still standing by the table, looked at his hand in wonder, as if expecting to see some mark or change from his interaction with the device. But where, or perhaps I should say, when has it gone? An excellent question, the time traveler replied. The truth is, I cannot say with certainty. The model is programmed to make a brief journey, perhaps a few hours into the future, before automatically returning to its point of origin. As if on cue, the air above the table began to shimmer once more. With a soft pop of displaced air, the machine reappeared, looking exactly as it had before its disappearance. The assembled guests crowded around, exclaiming in wonder and disbelief. The machine was cool to the touch, showing no signs of its extraordinary journey. Gentlemen, the time traveler said, his voice cutting through the excited chatter, what you have witnessed is merely the beginning. This model, impressive as it may be, is but a proof of concept. The real breakthrough lies in my laboratory. With that, he led his astonished guests from the drawing room and down a long corridor. At the end, he threw open a heavy oak door, revealing a cavernous space filled with an assortment of strange equipment and humming machinery. And there in the center of the room stood a larger version of the model they had just seen. This machine was the size of a small automobile, its metallic frame gleaming under the harsh electric lights. Ivory and crystal components pulsed with an inner light, and the air around it seemed to bend and warp, as if the very fabric of reality was being distorted by its presence. This, the time traveler announced with undisguised pride, is my full-scale time machine. With it, I intend to explore the vast expanse of time itself, to witness the birth of stars and the death of galaxies, to see the rise and fall of civilizations, and to unlock the deepest mysteries of our universe. The guests stood in awe, their minds reeling with the implications of what they were seeing. The psychologist was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. "My God," he said, "you're really going to do it, aren't you? You're going to travel through time." The time traveler nodded solemnly. "Indeed I am, and what I discover may change our understanding of reality itself." As the group gathered around the machine, each lost in their own thoughts about the implications of time travel, the time traveler's eyes gleamed with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. He knew that his journey would be fraught with dangers, paradoxes, unforeseen consequences, and the very real possibility of becoming lost in the vast expanse of time. But he also knew that the potential rewards were beyond measure. The knowledge he could gain, the mysteries he could unravel, the wonders he could witness, these were worth any risk. And yet, as he looked at the faces of his friends, he felt a pang of something akin to regret. These men, with their curiosity, their skepticism, their unwavering support, even in the face of the seemingly impossible, they represented the best of humanity. In his quest to explore time, would he be leaving behind the very things that made such exploration worthwhile? The time traveler pushed these thoughts aside. There would be time for such reflections later. For now, there was work to be done, preparations to be made. The greatest adventure in the history of mankind awaited, and he intended to meet it head-on. As the night wore on and his guests finally departed, their heads spinning with all they had seen and heard, the time traveler stood alone in his laboratory. His hand rested on the cool metal of the time machine, feeling the slight vibration of its internal mechanisms. Tomorrow he would embark on his journey. Tomorrow he would step into the unknown, armed only with his intellect and his courage. Tomorrow he would become the first true explorer of time. But tonight, in the quiet of his laboratory, surrounded by the fruits of his labor and the promise of discovery, the time traveler allowed himself a moment of pure, unadulterated wonder. For in creating this machine, in unlocking the secrets of time itself, he had touched the very fabric of the cosmos. And in doing so, he had glimpsed the infinite possibilities that lay hidden within the fourth dimension. As he dimmed the lights and prepared to leave, the time traveler cast one last glance at his creation. In the soft glow of the emergency lights, the time machine seemed to pulse with an inner life, as if eager to begin its journey across the vast expanse of time. Tomorrow, he thought, tomorrow we embark on the greatest adventure in the history of mankind. Tomorrow we rewrite the very nature of reality itself. With a smile of anticipation, the time traveler closed the laboratory door behind him, leaving his creation to hum softly in the darkness, a beacon of human ingenuity poised on the brink of the unknown. Chapter 3: A Tale of Temporal Odyssey. The soft glow of gaslight illuminated the elegant dining room of the time traveler's Victorian mansion, casting long shadows across the faces of the assembled guests. Outside, the night sky was a tapestry of stars, hinting at the vast, unexplored cosmos that lay beyond. Inside, an air of anticipation and skepticism hung heavy in the air, as thick as the cigar smoke that curled lazily towards the ornate ceiling. I arrived late, my pocket watch showing 7:30 as I hurried up the steps to the time traveler's residence. The door was answered by his housekeeper, who ushered me into the dining room with a worried expression. As I entered, I was struck by the palpable tension in the air. The medical man, a portly gentleman with a neatly trimmed beard, was the first to acknowledge my arrival. "Ah, there you are," he said, his voice tinged with relief. "We were just debating whether to start without our host." I glanced around the room, taking in the familiar faces. The psychologist, a thin man with piercing eyes, sat with his fingers steepled before him, lost in thought. The editor, a boisterous fellow known for his skepticism, was engaged in animated conversation with a journalist I didn't recognize. In the corner, a silent man with a beard, whose name I could never recall, observed the proceedings with detached interest. "No sign of him, then?" I inquired, settling into an empty chair. The psychologist shook his head. "Not a whisper. Most peculiar, especially after last week's demonstration." Ah, yes, the demonstration. The memory of that evening still sent a shiver down my spine. The time traveler had presented us with a small, intricately crafted model of what he claimed to be a time machine. With the press of a lever, the device had vanished before our very eyes, only to reappear moments later. It was a feat that defied explanation, yet many of us, myself included, had been inclined to dismiss it as an elaborate parlor trick. The editor snorted derisively. Demonstration? More like a conjurer's act. I've seen more convincing illusions at a county fair. The medical man, ever the voice of reason, interjected. Now, let's not be hasty in our judgments. While I admit the disappearance of the model was perplexing, we mustn't discount the possibility of a genuine scientific breakthrough. Science? The editor scoffed. What science? Time travel is the stuff of fantasy novels, not serious scientific inquiry. As the debate raged on, I found my thoughts drifting to the time traveler himself. He had always been an eccentric figure, brilliant but prone to flights of fancy. Yet there had been something in his eyes that night. A fire, an intensity that spoke of a man on the brink of a monumental discovery. Suddenly, the door burst open with a bang that made us all jump. There, silhouetted in the doorway, stood the time traveler. But he was not the composed, dapper gentleman we had come to know. This man was a wreck, his clothes tattered and stained, his hair wild and unkempt, his face haggard and drawn. For a moment, we all sat in stunned silence. Then, as if released from a spell, we sprang into action. The medical man was the first to reach him, guiding the time traveler to a chair with gentle hands. "Good God, man," he exclaimed, his professional demeanor slipping in the face of such unexpected circumstances. "What on earth has happened to you?" The time traveler's eyes, bloodshot and unfocused, swept across the room. When he spoke, his voice was a hoarse whisper. "Water, please." The psychologist hurried to pour a glass, which the time traveler drained in one long gulp. As he set the empty glass down, I noticed his hands were shaking. I apologize for my tardiness," he said, attempting a weak smile. "I'm afraid I've had quite the journey." The editor, his skepticism momentarily forgotten in the face of such a shocking appearance, leaned forward. "Journey? What sort of journey leaves a man in such a state?" The time traveler's eyes focused on the editor, and for a moment I saw a flicker of the old fire return. "A journey through time itself, my dear fellow, a journey that has taken me to the very ends of human history and beyond." A ripple of disbelief ran through the room. The journalist, who had been silent until now, let out a nervous laugh. "Surely you jest," he said. "This must be some sort of elaborate prank." But as I studied the time traveler's face, the lines of exhaustion etched deep, the haunted look in his eyes. I felt a chill run down my spine. This was no prank. Whatever had happened to our friend, it had shaken him to his very core. The medical man, ever practical, spoke up. "You need sustenance," he said firmly. "Food and drink before any explanations. Your body has clearly undergone significant stress." For a moment it seemed the time traveler might protest, but then his shoulders sagged and he nodded wearily. Yes, I suppose you're right." As we settled in for dinner, an air of surreal anticipation settled over the gathering. The time traveler ate ravenously, as if he hadn't seen food in days. We watched in fascinated silence, each lost in our own speculations about what could have befallen our friend. Finally, after what seemed an eternity, the time traveler pushed his plate away and leaned back in his chair. His color had improved somewhat, and there was a new steadiness to his hands as he reached for his wine glass. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice stronger now, "I owe you all an explanation. What I am about to tell you will strain the very limits of your belief. It will challenge everything you think you know about the nature of reality, of time, of our place in the cosmos." He paused, his gaze sweeping across our faces. "I ask only that you listen with open minds. Reserve your judgments, your skepticism, your disbelief until I have finished my tale. For I have seen wonders beyond imagining, horrors that defy description. I have witnessed the birth and death of civilizations, the rise and fall of species. I have gazed upon the final moments of our world and glimpsed the ultimate fate of our universe." The room had fallen deathly silent. Even the editor, normally so quick with a sardonic comment, seemed struck dumb by the gravity in the time traveler's voice. "If you are willing," the time traveler continued, "I will share with you the account of my journey. But I warn you, the knowledge I have gained comes at a great cost. Once heard, it cannot be unheard. It will change the way you view your world, your lives, the very nature of existence itself. He looked at each of us in turn, his eyes burning with an intensity that made me want to look away. Are you prepared for that? For a long moment, no one spoke. Then slowly, the psychologist nodded. We are ready, he said softly. Tell us your story. The time traveler's shoulders seemed to sag with relief. Very well, he said, but not here. Let us adjourn to the smoking room. What I have to say will take some time, and we may as well be comfortable. As we filed out of the dining room, I couldn't help but notice the change that had come over our little group. The skepticism, the jovial disbelief that had marked our earlier conversations was gone, replaced by a sense of hushed anticipation. Whatever the time traveler had experienced, it had left an indelible mark upon him. And I knew with a certainty that chilled me to my core that by the time his tale was done, we too would be forever changed. The smoking room was a sanctuary of masculine comfort, all leather chairs and rich mahogany paneling. As we settled in, the time traveler moved to stand before the fireplace, his figure silhouetted against the dancing flames. The warm glow seemed to accentuate the lines of exhaustion on his face, the haunted look in his eyes. Before I begin, he said, his voice low and intense, I must ask for your patience. What I am about to relate will challenge the very foundations of your understanding of reality. It will require you to set aside preconceptions, to open your minds to possibilities beyond the realm of conventional science. The editor, never one to stay silent for long, couldn't resist a jab. Come now, old chap, surely you don't expect us to believe you've actually traveled through time. It's scientifically impossible. The time traveler's gaze locked onto the editor, and I saw something flicker in those weary eyes, a mixture of pity and frustration. Impossible? He echoed. My dear fellow, the history of science is littered with the wreckage of ideas once thought impossible, the Earth revolving around the Sun, the existence of subatomic particles, the curvature of space-time itself. Each of these concepts was once deemed absurd, heretical, impossible, until they weren't. He turned to address us all, his voice taking on the familiar cadence of a lecture. Consider, if you will, Einstein's theory of relativity. It tells us that time is not the absolute unchanging dimension we once believed it to be. It is malleable, affected by gravity and velocity. The faster an object moves, the slower time passes, for it relative to a stationary observer. The psychologist leaned forward, his interest piqued. But surely the energies required to exploit such effects would be astronomical. A ghost of a smile flickered across the time traveler's face. Indeed they would be, using conventional means. But what if there were a way to tap into the very fabric of space-time itself? To harness the limitless energy of the quantum vacuum? He began to pace, his words coming faster now, filled with the passion of a man unveiling a great discovery. Imagine, if you will, a machine capable of creating a localized temporal field, a bubble of altered space-time, if you like, in which the normal rules of temporal progression no longer apply. By manipulating this field, one could move through time as easily as we move through space. The medical man shook his head slowly. It's incredible. But how? How could such a device possibly function? The time traveler's eyes gleamed with excitement. Ah, that's where the true brilliance lies. The heart of my machine is a crystal lattice of exotic matter, a substance with negative energy density. This lattice, when subjected to precise electromagnetic fields, creates what I call a temporal vortex. It's a region of space-time where the arrow of time becomes flexible. He paused, gauging our reactions. The room had fallen silent, each of us grappling with the implications of what we were hearing. Even the editor seemed too stunned to offer his usual sarcastic commentary. But that's not all, the time traveler continued. The machine also incorporates a quantum field manipulator, allowing it to tap into the zero-point energy of the vacuum. This provides the enormous power needed to maintain the temporal vortex and propel the machine through time. The journalist, who had been scribbling furiously in his notebook, looked up with a frown. But if such a device were possible, surely it would violate causality? The grandfather paradox and all that? The time traveler nodded approvingly. An excellent question. The nature of causality in a universe that allows time travel is complex. My journey has led me to believe that the timeline is far more resilient than we might imagine. It seems to have a way of preserving itself against paradoxes. He fell silent for a moment, his gaze distant, as if recalling some memory too vast or terrible for words. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, filled with a mixture of awe and trepidation. Gentlemen, what I have seen, the wonders I have witnessed, they defy description. I have gazed upon the birth of stars and the death of galaxies. I have seen humanity's distant descendants evolved into forms we can scarcely comprehend, and I have stood witness to the ultimate fate of our universe as entropy claims its final victory. The time traveler's words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of cosmic implications. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the soft crackle of the fire and the ticking of the mantel clock, a mundane reminder of time's inexorable march that now seemed somehow inadequate. Finally, the psychologist broke the silence. "My God," he whispered, "if what you're saying is true, the implications for our understanding of reality, of our place in the universe, are staggering," the time traveler finished for him. "Yes. And that is why I must ask for your complete attention, your suspension of disbelief, as I recount my journey in full. For what I have learned may well determine the fate of our species, of our entire reality." He looked at each of us in turn, his eyes burning with an intensity that made me want to look away. "Are you prepared to hear it? To have your world turned upside down, your fundamental assumptions about the nature of existence challenged?" One by one, we nodded. Even the editor, his usual skepticism seemingly shaken, gave a grudging assent. The time traveler took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders as if preparing to shoulder some great burden. "Very well," he said. "Then let us begin at the beginning. 8 days ago, or perhaps a million years hence, depending on your perspective, I stepped into my machine and embarked upon the greatest journey in the history of mankind." As the time traveler launched into his extraordinary tale, I felt a shiver of anticipation run down my spine. Whatever we were about to hear, I knew with absolute certainty that none of us would ever be the same again. For we stood on the brink of a new understanding of our universe, our reality, our very existence. And as I settled in to listen, I couldn't help but wonder what wonders and what terrors awaited us in the vast, uncharted realms of time. Chapter 4. Time Traveling. The time traveler leaned forward, his eyes alight with a mixture of excitement and trepidation as he began his extraordinary tale. The assembled guests, their skepticism momentarily forgotten, hung on his every word. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice low and intense, "imagine, if you will, the moment of truth. After years of theoretical work, countless failed experiments, and sleepless nights grappling with the fundamental nature of time itself, I stood before my completed time machine." He closed his eyes for a moment, as if reliving the scene. It was a thing of beauty, a symphony of brass and ivory, quartz crystals pulsing with an otherworldly light. At its heart lay a crystalline lattice of exotic matter, a substance with negative energy density that I had synthesized through a process that pushed the very boundaries of quantum mechanics. The psychologist leaned forward, his scientific curiosity piqued. Negative energy density? But surely that's impossible. The time traveler smiled. "Ah, my friend, the realm of the impossible shrinks with each passing day. This exotic matter, when subjected to precise electromagnetic fields, creates what I call a temporal vortex, a region of space-time where the arrow of time becomes flexible." He paused, gauging the reactions of his audience. Even the normally skeptical editor seemed too engrossed to offer his usual sarcastic commentary. "But the true genius," the time traveler continued, "lies in the quantum field manipulator. This device allows the machine to tap into the zero-point energy of the vacuum itself, providing the enormous power needed to maintain the temporal vortex and propel the machine through time." The medical man shook his head in wonder. It's incredible. But how does one actually operate such a device?" The time traveler's eyes gleamed. Ah, that's where the elegance of the design truly shines. The controls are deceptively simple. Two levers. One initiates the temporal field, while the other controls the direction and speed of temporal displacement. Push it forward to travel into the future, pull it back to journey into the past. He paused, his expression growing more serious. Of course, the implications of backwards time travel are problematic. The potential for paradoxes, for fundamental disruptions of causality, led me to focus my initial experiments solely on forward progression. The journalist, who had been scribbling furiously in his notebook, looked up with a frown. But surely any form of time travel would create paradoxes, the grandfather paradox and all that. The time traveler nodded approvingly. An excellent point. The nature of causality in a universe that allows time travel is complex. My journey has led me to believe that the timeline is far more resilient than we might imagine. It seems to have a way of preserving itself against paradoxes. But that's a discussion for another time. Let me tell you of my first journey. He took a deep breath, his gaze becoming distant as he recalled the momentous event. I stood before the machine, my heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and terror. With trembling hands, I engaged the temporal field generator. The air around the machine began to shimmer, reality itself seeming to bend and warp. The time traveler's voice took on a more urgent tone as he continued. I grasped the lever, hesitated for just a moment, then pushed it forward. The sensation was indescribable. It felt as if I was falling, yet simultaneously being stretched and compressed. My vision blurred, colors smearing into indistinct streaks. He paused, swallowing hard at the memory. For a terrifying moment, I feared I had made a catastrophic miscalculation. But then, as my senses adjusted, I began to perceive the passage of time around me. The room had fallen deathly silent, the assembled guests hanging on every word. At first, the changes were subtle. The shadows in my laboratory began to shift rapidly, the sunlight streaming through the windows, flickering like a silent film projection. I glanced at the clock on the wall, watching in awe as the hands spun with dizzying speed. The time traveler's eyes were wide now, reliving the wonder of that first journey. Emboldened by my initial success, I pushed the lever further, and that's when the true marvel began. He gestured expansively, as if trying to encompass the vastness of his experience. The alternation of day and night became a painful flicker, like a stroboscopic lamp. The sun traced a burning arc across the sky, rising and setting with breathtaking rapidity. The moon, a pale undulating band, pulsed through its phases in the blink of an eye. The psychologist leaned forward, fascinated. But how did you perceive such rapid changes without suffering severe psychological trauma? The time traveler nodded appreciatively at the question. An excellent point. I believe the temporal field surrounding the machine creates a kind of buffer, allowing my consciousness to process the rapid flow of information without overload. It's as if my perception is partially decoupled from normal space-time, allowing me to observe without being overwhelmed. He continued his narration, his voice filled with wonder. As I accelerated further into the future, the landscape outside my laboratory window began to transform. Trees grew and withered in the span of heartbeats. Massive buildings rose and fell like waves on a cosmic ocean. The very geography of the land seemed to shift and flow. The time traveler's expression grew more somber. But it wasn't all wonder and beauty. I witnessed great storms, their fury condensed into moments of terrifying intensity. I saw the scars of what might have been wars or natural disasters, healing and reopening as civilizations rose and fell. He paused, his gaze distant. It was a humbling experience, gentlemen, to see the grand sweep of history, the rise and fall of empires, the relentless march of time. It puts our own brief lives into stark perspective. The editor, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, spoke up. But surely at some point you decided to stop, to explore this future world. The time traveler nodded. Indeed, after what felt like both an eternity and a mere moment, my curiosity overcame my fear. I began to decelerate, watching as the blur of time began to resolve into discernible images once more. His voice took on a note of trepidation. I must confess, gentlemen, that as the machine slowed, I was gripped by a sudden panic. What if I materialized inside a solid object? The consequences would be catastrophic. The room fell silent as the implications of his words sank in. The medical man paled visibly. But fortune, it seems, was on my side. The time traveler continued. As the temporal field collapsed and reality reasserted itself, I found myself on a grassy hill, surrounded by unfamiliar vegetation. A hailstorm was in progress, the icy pellets rattling against the machine's frame. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. And there, looming before me, was a sight that took my breath away. A massive statue of a sphinx, its features worn by the passage of untold millennia, yet still radiating an aura of ancient power and mystery. The time traveler paused, allowing the image to sink in. The psychologist broke the silence. A sphinx, but what could it signify? I wish I knew, the time traveler replied. Was it a relic of our civilization, preserved through unimaginable spans of time? Or the creation of some future culture, perhaps inspired by legends of our own era? At that moment, I realized the true magnitude of what I had done. I had stepped into a world utterly alien, separated from my own time by a gulf of years I could scarcely comprehend. His voice grew softer, tinged with vulnerability. I must confess, gentlemen, that in that moment I was overcome by fear. The enormity of my situation crashed down upon me. I was alone, in a world I didn't understand, with no way of knowing what dangers might lurk in this strange future. The editor leaned forward, his skepticism momentarily forgotten. But surely you didn't simply turn back, after coming so far? The time traveler shook his head. No, I didn't. Despite my fear, my scientific curiosity, that relentless drive to know, to understand, reasserted itself. I resolved to explore, to try and make sense of this brave new world I had stumbled into. He paused, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. And it was then, gentlemen, that I had my first encounter with the inhabitants of this future era. The room fell silent, the tension palpable as the assembled guests waited for him to continue. I heard voices, the time traveler said, his voice barely above a whisper. Strange musical voices, unlike any language I had ever heard. And then, emerging from a nearby structure, I saw them. He closed his eyes as if visualizing the scene. They were humanoid, but different. Smaller, more delicate than modern humans. Their movements were graceful, almost ethereal, and their faces were beautiful beyond description, with an androgynous quality that defied easy categorization. The time traveler opened his eyes, his gaze sweeping across his rapt audience. One of them approached me, clad in a flowing purple tunic. For I hesitate to assign a gender, its eyes were filled with a mixture of curiosity and something else. Intelligence, certainly, but also a strange innocence, a childlike wonder that both reassured and unsettled me. He leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. In that moment, gentlemen, I realized the true magnitude of what I had accomplished. I had not merely traveled through time. I had opened a window into the future of our species, into the grand sweep of human evolution. The time traveler fell silent, lost in the memory of that extraordinary encounter. The room was hushed, each man grappling with the implications of what they had heard. Finally, the psychologist spoke. "My God," he whispered, "if what you're saying is true, the implications for our understanding of human evolution, of the future of our species, are staggering," the time traveler finished for him. Yes, and what I learned in the days that followed, well, it would shake the very foundations of our understanding of reality, of our place in the cosmos. He looked at each of his guests in turn, his eyes burning with an intensity that made them want to look away. Are you prepared to hear more? To have your world turned upside down, your fundamental assumptions about the nature of existence challenged? One by one, they nodded. Even the editor, his usual skepticism seemingly shaken, gave a grudging assent. The time traveler took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders as if preparing to shoulder some great burden. "Very well," he said. "Then let me tell you of the wonders and the terrors that I encountered in that distant future. For what I discovered may well determine the fate of our species, of our entire reality." As the time traveler launched into the next phase of his extraordinary tale, the assembled guests leaned forward, their minds reeling with the implications of what they had heard. For they stood on the brink of a new understanding of their universe, their reality, their very existence. And as they settled in to listen, each man couldn't help but wonder what revelations and what warnings awaited them in the vast, uncharted realms of humanity's future. Chapter 5, In the Golden Age. The time traveler paused in his narration, his eyes distant as he recalled the extraordinary encounter. The assembled guests leaned forward, their skepticism momentarily forgotten in the face of such a vivid tale. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice low and intense, "imagine, if you will, stepping into a world utterly alien yet hauntingly familiar. A world where the very air seems to whisper of countless millennia past, where every blade of grass, every mote of dust, is infused with the weight of unimaginable time." He closed his eyes for a moment, as if reliving the scene. As I stood there, my mind reeling from the enormity of my journey, I saw a figure emerge from the lush vegetation surrounding me. It was humanoid, certainly, but so delicate, so ethereal that for a moment I wondered if I was hallucinating. The medical man leaned forward, his professional curiosity piqued. "Can you describe this being in more detail?" The time traveler nodded, his eyes snapping open. It was small, no more than 4 feet tall, with a lithe, graceful build that seemed almost fragile. Its skin was pale, with a faint luminescence that I initially attributed to the strange quality of light in this future world. But what struck me most were its eyes, large liquid pools of deepest amber, filled with a childlike wonder that both reassured and unsettled me. He paused, a slight frown creasing his brow. But there was something else in those eyes, something I couldn't quite place at the time. An absence, perhaps, of something I had expected to see. The psychologist nodded thoughtfully. "Fear? Suspicion?" "Precisely," the time traveler agreed. "This being showed no fear, no wariness at all in the face of my sudden appearance. It approached me with a gentle curiosity, reaching out to touch my clothing as if to confirm I was real." He smiled at the memory, and then it laughed, a sound so pure, so musical, that it seemed to resonate with the very air around us. It spoke, but in a language unlike any I had ever heard, liquid and melodious, more akin to birdsong than human speech. The editor, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, spoke up. "But surely one being, however strange, couldn't tell you much about this future world." The time traveler's smile widened. "Ah, but it wasn't alone for long. Within moments, a group of 8 or 10 similar creatures had emerged from the surrounding foliage, all regarding me with the same mixture of curiosity and innocence, I suppose is the best word." He leaned back in his chair, his gaze sweeping across his rapt audience. They surrounded me, these delicate future humans, their gentle touches confirming my solidity. I felt no threat from them. Indeed, their movements were so graceful, so lacking in any hint of aggression, that I found myself relaxing despite the strangeness of the situation. The time traveler's expression grew more serious. It was then that I remembered my machine. These beings, in their childlike curiosity, were examining it closely. Fearing they might accidentally activate it, I quickly removed the control levers, securing them in my pocket. He paused, his brow furrowing in concentration. As I did so, I took the opportunity to observe these future humans more closely. They were remarkably uniform in appearance, all with the same curly hair, small ears, and pointed chins. But it was their eyes that truly captured my attention. Large, mild, and disturbingly devoid of the deep interest or intellectual curiosity I had expected to see in beings so far advanced from our own time. The psychologist leaned forward, intrigued. "How did you attempt to communicate with them?" The time traveler sighed, a hint of frustration creeping into his voice. I tried the most basic method I could think of, pointing and naming. I indicated my time machine, then pointed to the sun, trying to convey the concept of time travel. One of the creatures responded by making a sound like thunder, which I initially took as a promising sign of understanding. He shook his head ruefully. But as I continued my attempts at communication, it became increasingly clear that these beings were not the advanced, hyper-intelligent descendants of humanity I had imagined. Their responses were childlike, their attention spans short. They seemed more interested in adorning me with garlands of strange, sweetly scented flowers than in grasping the concepts I was trying to convey. The editor couldn't suppress a snort of derision. So your great journey into the future led you to a world of simpering children. How disappointing. The time traveler fixed him with a stern gaze. Disappointing, perhaps, in some ways, but also fascinating and deeply thought-provoking. For what forces could have shaped humanity into these gentle, seemingly carefree beings? What price had been paid for this apparent utopia of eternal childhood? He paused, allowing his words to sink in. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Despite my initial disappointment, I found myself charmed by their behavior. They led me, bedecked in flowers like some pagan god, to a massive structure nearby. A building of such grand proportions and intricate design that it took my breath away. The time traveler's eyes grew distant as he described the scene. Imagine, gentlemen, a palace that would put Versailles to shame, its soaring spires seeming to pierce the very heavens. Yet it was a palace in decay, its once gleaming surfaces worn by the passage of countless years, its stained glass windows shattered, allowing tendrils of vegetation to creep inside. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. As we entered, I found myself in a vast hall. Its floor a mosaic of worn stones that might once have depicted great historical scenes. Broken furniture lay scattered about, intermingled with piles of strange exotic fruits and cushions of every imaginable hue. The medical man frowned. Fruits, were these the sole sustenance of these future beings? The time traveler nodded. Indeed, they appeared to be strict vegetarians, subsisting entirely on these fruits. And I must say, some were quite delicious, particularly one with a floury texture encased in a peculiar three-sided husk. He paused, a wry smile playing at the corners of his mouth. It was here, amidst this feast of future flora, that I began my first real attempts to learn their language. I started simple, pointing to fruits and repeating the sounds they made, trying to grasp the basics of their vocabulary. The psychologist leaned forward, fascinated. And how did that progress? The time traveler's smile faded slightly. Slowly, I'm afraid. These beings, for all their charm, tired easily. Our lessons were brief and sporadic, punctuated by long periods of what I can only describe as indolent relaxation. They would lounge on the cushions, nibbling fruits and engaging in what seemed to be aimless chatter, showing little interest in sustained intellectual engagement. He sighed, a note of frustration creeping into his voice. I felt like a schoolmaster among particularly frivolous children. Every small achievement in communication was met with peals of laughter and clapping, as if I had performed some great trick. It was disconcerting, to say the least. The editor couldn't contain himself any longer. But surely, man, you must have realized the implications. A future where humanity has devolved into these simpletons? It's preposterous. The time traveler fixed him with a steady gaze. Is it, though? Consider, if you will, the trajectory of our own society. We strive constantly to make life easier, to eliminate struggle and hardship. But what happens when that goal is finally achieved? When there are no more challenges to overcome, no more frontiers to conquer? He paused, allowing his words to sink in. These beings, these Eloi, as I came to call them, seemed to be the end result of that trajectory. A humanity that had conquered all external threats, eliminated all need for struggle or strife. But in doing so, had they also eliminated the very qualities that made us human? Our drive, our curiosity, our relentless pursuit of knowledge and understanding. The room fell silent as the assembled guests grappled with the implications of his words. The psychologist was the first to speak. But surely there must be more to their society than what you've described, some hidden depth, some greater purpose? The time traveler nodded slowly. I had the same thought, my friend, and indeed, as the days passed, I began to notice oddities, inconsistencies that hinted at a darker undercurrent to this seemingly idyllic world. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. For you see, gentlemen, despite the apparent abundance of their world, the Eloi lived in a state of low-grade fear. They were terrified of the dark, huddling together in their great halls as night fell. And sometimes, in the depths of that darkness, I heard sounds, movements that spoke of something else, something that lurked just beyond the edges of this sunlit paradise. The time traveler paused, his eyes sweeping across his now silent audience. But perhaps I'm getting ahead of myself again. Let me tell you of my attempts to delve deeper into their society, to understand the forces that had shaped this strange future. As he launched into the next phase of his extraordinary tale, the assembled guests leaned forward, their minds reeling with the implications of what they had heard. For in this story of humanity's distant descendants, they saw reflected the deepest questions of their own time: the nature of progress, the price of utopia, and the essential qualities that define what it means to be human. The fire crackled softly in the grate, casting dancing shadows across the room. Outside, the night pressed against the windows, a reminder of the vast, mysterious universe that lay beyond. And in that moment, as they listened with rapt attention to the time traveler's tale, each man felt a profound sense of wonder and a creeping unease at the possible futures that awaited their species in the vast, uncharted realms of time. Chapter 6: The Sunset of Mankind. The time traveler paused in his narration, his eyes distant as he recalled the strange, beautiful yet ultimately unsettling world he had encountered. The assembled guests leaned forward, their skepticism momentarily forgotten in the face of such a vivid tale. Gentlemen, he began, his voice low and thoughtful, imagine, if you will, a world where the relentless struggle for survival that has defined our species since time immemorial has simply ceased. A world where every need is met, every comfort provided, every danger eliminated. It sounds like paradise, does it not? He shook his head slowly, a wry smile playing at the corners of his mouth. And yet, as I observed these future beings, these Eloi, as I came to call them, I couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. For in their childlike demeanor, their lack of curiosity, their utter contentment with mere existence, I saw not the pinnacle of human achievement, but its ultimate decadence. The psychologist leaned forward, fascinated. Can you elaborate on your observations? What led you to this conclusion? The time traveler nodded, his gaze focusing as he delved into his memories. It began with small things. Their attention spans, for instance, were remarkably short. During our conversations, if one could call them that, they would flit from one topic to another, like butterflies in a garden, never lingering long enough to grasp any complex concept. He gestured expansively, his voice taking on a lecturing tone. Consider, if you will, the evolutionary pressures that shaped our own intellects. The need to remember where food could be found, to anticipate the movements of prey and predator alike, to navigate complex social hierarchies. All of these drove the development of our cognitive abilities. But in a world where all needs are met effortlessly, where no dangers lurk, what becomes of that hard-won intelligence? The editor snorted derisively. Surely you're not suggesting that humanity could simply devolve? The time traveler fixed him with a steady gaze. Not devolve precisely, but adapt. Evolution doesn't favor intelligence for its own sake, my friend. It favors traits that enhance survival and reproduction. And in this world I found myself in, it seemed that raw intellect was no longer a survival advantage. He paused, allowing his words to sink in before continuing. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me describe what I saw as I ventured out of that great hall, into the sunlit world beyond. The time traveler's eyes took on a distant look as he recalled the scene. The landscape that greeted me was both familiar and utterly alien. The Thames Valley stretched before me, but the river had shifted its course over the millennia. Where once stood the sprawling metropolis of London, I saw only gently rolling hills, dotted with clusters of enormous palace-like structures. He leaned forward, his voice dropping as if sharing a secret. And everywhere, gentlemen, everywhere I looked, I saw ruins. Great crumbling edifices of what must have once been magnificent buildings, now overgrown with strange, beautiful plants that seemed to have lost all capacity for harm. No thorns, no stinging nettles, nature itself seemed to have been tamed and made benign. The medical man frowned. But surely there must have been smaller dwellings, homes for individual families. The time traveler shook his head. That's just it. There were none. No small houses, no individual dwellings of any kind. Only these vast communal structures. And as I observed the Eloi more closely, I began to form a theory about the society that had produced them. He paused, gathering his thoughts. Imagine, if you will, the logical endpoint of certain social trends we see in our own time. The push towards communal living, the erosion of traditional family structures, the blurring of gender roles. Now extend that process over thousands, perhaps millions of years. The time traveler's voice took on a more urgent tone. What I saw was a society that had taken these concepts to their ultimate conclusion. There were no discernible differences between the sexes, not in physical appearance, not in dress, not in behavior. The very concept of individual family units seemed to have vanished. The psychologist nodded slowly. A kind of perfect communism, then, where all property, all resources, even reproduction itself, are communally managed. Precisely, the time traveler agreed. And in such a society, where every need is met collectively, where there is no struggle for resources or status, what becomes of the traits we value so highly? Strength, intelligence, ambition, all products of a world where survival is not guaranteed. He gestured towards the window, where the night pressed against the glass. Think of our own world, gentlemen. The constant fight against disease, against hunger, against the very elements themselves. It's that struggle that has honed our bodies and minds, that has driven us to create, to innovate, to strive for something beyond mere existence. The time traveler's voice grew softer, tinged with a mix of wonder and sadness. But in this future world, that struggle has ended. Humanity has triumphed over nature so completely that there is no more need for strength or cunning. The air is free of disease-carrying insects. The plants yield abundant fruit without the need for agriculture. Even the climate seems to have been tamed to perpetual mildness. He paused, his gaze sweeping across his rapt audience. And the result? A race of beautiful, childlike beings, living in a state of perpetual, carefree innocence. They have no need for intellectual pursuits, for there are no problems to solve. No need for physical prowess, for there are no predators to flee, no prey to chase. The editor couldn't contain himself any longer. But surely this is absurd. You're suggesting that all of human progress, all of our achievements, led to this? A race of simpering idiots in a garden paradise. The time traveler held up a hand, a wry smile playing at the corners of his mouth. I understand your skepticism, my friend. Indeed, I shared it at first. But consider the logic of it. In a world where every need is met, where there is no scarcity, no danger, no challenge of any kind, what drives progress? What fuels ambition? He leaned back in his chair, his eyes taking on a distant look. I climbed a hill near one of their great communal dwellings, seeking a better vantage point. And as I stood there, watching the sun set over this strange, beautiful world, I was struck by the utter absence of certain things we take for granted. The time traveler's voice took on a more lecturing tone. There were no fences, no boundaries of any kind, no signs of agriculture or industry. The entire world seemed to be one vast, perfectly manicured garden, and in that moment I realized the full implications of what I was seeing. He paused, allowing the tension to build before continuing. This was a world where the very concept of private property had ceased to exist, where the need for individual achievement, for personal legacy, had been rendered obsolete, a world where the collective had truly subsumed the individual. The psychologist leaned forward, his brow furrowed in thought. But surely there must have been some form of governance, some system for making decisions, allocating resources. The time traveler shook his head slowly. If there was, I saw no evidence of it. And that, perhaps, is the most unsettling aspect of all, for it suggests a level of social engineering so profound, so complete, that the very need for active governance has been eliminated. He gestured expansively, his voice taking on a note of awe tinged with horror. Imagine, gentlemen, a society where every individual's needs and desires have been so perfectly aligned with the collective good that no external control is necessary, where the very concept of dissent, of individual ambition, has been bred out of the species. The room fell silent as the implications of his words sank in. The medical man was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. But that's monstrous. To strip away everything that makes us human. The time traveler nodded solemnly. Is it, though? Or is it the logical endpoint of our own drive for comfort, for security, for the elimination of all hardship and struggle? We strive to create a world free of want, free of conflict. But at what cost? He leaned forward, his eyes burning with intensity. For in achieving that perfect social equilibrium, in eliminating all need for striving and growth, humanity seems to have paid a terrible price. The price of stasis, of intellectual and physical atrophy. The time traveler's voice dropped to a near whisper. And yet, even as I formed these theories, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something. That there was some deeper, darker undercurrent to this seemingly idyllic world that I had yet to uncover. He paused, his gaze sweeping across his now silent audience. For you see, gentlemen, despite the apparent abundance of their world, despite the utter absence of any visible threat or hardship, the Eloi lived in a state of low-grade fear. They were terrified of the dark, huddling together in their great halls as night fell. And sometimes, in the depths of that darkness, I heard sounds, movements that spoke of something else, something that lurked just beyond the edges of this sunlit paradise. The time traveler fell silent, allowing the weight of his words to settle over the room. The assembled guests exchanged uneasy glances, each grappling with the implications of what they had heard. Finally, the psychologist spoke, his voice hesitant. But surely there must be more to it. Some aspect of their society, their world, that you hadn't yet discovered. The time traveler nodded slowly, a grim smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Indeed, my friend. And it was in seeking answers to these questions that I stumbled upon the true horror that lurked beneath the surface of this seeming paradise. A horror that would shake me to my very core and force me to reconsider everything I thought I knew about the nature of progress, of civilization, of humanity itself. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. For you see, gentlemen, the Eloi were not alone in that future world, and the true inheritors of our civilization's legacy were far more terrifying than I could have possibly imagined. As the time traveler prepared to launch into the next phase of his extraordinary tale, the assembled guests leaned forward, their minds reeling with the implications of what they had heard. For in this story of humanity's distant descendants, they saw reflected the deepest questions of their own time: the nature of progress, the price of utopia, and the essential qualities that define what it means to be human. The fire crackled softly in the grate, casting dancing shadows across the room. Outside, the night pressed against the windows, a reminder of the vast, mysterious universe that lay beyond. And in that moment, as they waited with bated breath for the time traveler to continue, each man felt a profound sense of wonder and a creeping dread at the possible futures that awaited their species in the vast, uncharted realms of time. Chapter 7. A Sudden Shock. The time traveler paused in his narration, his eyes distant as he recalled the moment of horrifying realization. The assembled guests leaned forward, their skepticism momentarily forgotten in the face of such palpable emotion. Gentlemen, he began, his voice barely above a whisper, imagine, if you will, the utter desolation of finding yourself stranded in a world utterly alien, separated from everything you know by an unfathomable gulf of time. Now multiply that feeling 1,000-fold, and you might begin to grasp the terror that gripped me when I discovered my time machine had vanished. He closed his eyes for a moment, as if reliving the scene. I had been exploring the strange, beautiful world of the Eloi, my mind reeling with theories about their society and the forces that had shaped it. But as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the landscape, a chilling thought struck me with the force of a physical blow. The time traveler's eyes snapped open, filled with a haunted look. My machine, in all my excitement, all my wonderment at this future world, I had left it unattended on that grassy hill. With trembling limbs, I rushed back to the spot, my heart pounding with a dread I can scarcely describe. He paused, swallowing hard. The hill was empty. The machine, my sole link to my own time, my own world, was gone. The medical man leaned forward, his brow furrowed with concern. But surely it couldn't have simply vanished. Perhaps you misremembered the location. The time traveler shook his head vehemently. No, no, I was certain. The indentations in the grass where it had stood were still visible. But the machine itself, it was as if it had never existed. He stood abruptly, beginning to pace the room as he continued his tale. I'm not ashamed to admit, gentlemen, that in that moment I lost all composure. I tore across the landscape, shouting, demanding answers from the bewildered Eloi. But they merely stared at me with those large, mild eyes, uncomprehending and increasingly frightened by my manic behavior. The time traveler's voice took on a frantic edge, mirroring his state of mind in that distant future. I searched through the night, my mind conjuring increasingly horrific scenarios. Had some unknown force destroyed the machine? Had it somehow activated itself, vanishing into another time without me? Or worst of all, had I somehow hallucinated the entire journey, my mind fracturing under the strain of what I thought I had accomplished? He paused in his pacing, his gaze sweeping across his rapt audience. As dawn broke, I found myself once more before the great white sphinx, its impassive face seeming to mock my desperation. And it was then, in the cold light of morning, that a spark of rational thought finally penetrated my panic. The psychologist leaned forward, intrigued. What was it that caught your attention? The time traveler's eyes gleamed with the rekindling of scientific curiosity. The pedestal of the Sphinx, gentlemen. As I examined it more closely, I noticed subtle inconsistencies in its structure. Hairline seams that suggested it was not a solid block, but rather a hollow shell. And more intriguingly, faint marks on the ground nearby. Marks that could have been made by my machine being dragged across the grass. He began to pace again, his voice taking on a more animated tone. It was a hypothesis, nothing more. But it gave me a focus, a direction for my efforts. I began to examine the pedestal more closely, searching for any mechanism that might open it. The time traveler's expression darkened. But it was then that I encountered a new obstacle. The Eloi, who had been so docile, so welcoming before, suddenly became agitated. They pulled at my clothes, trying to lead me away from the Sphinx. When I resisted, their distress only increased. He shook his head, bewilderment clear in his voice. I couldn't understand it. These gentle, childlike beings seemed genuinely frightened, not of me, but of my interest in the Sphinx. It was as if the very idea of exploring its secrets was taboo. The editor snorted derisively. So these future humans not only lost their intelligence, but also developed irrational superstitions. The time traveler fixed him with a steady gaze. Perhaps, or perhaps their fear was based on something all too rational. Remember, gentlemen, that despite the apparent paradise they lived in, the Eloi showed signs of an underlying anxiety. Their fear of the dark, their tendency to cluster together, these suggested the presence of some threat, some danger that I had yet to uncover. He paused, allowing his words to sink in before continuing. It was then that I realized the magnitude of my ignorance. I had barely scratched the surface of understanding this future world. If I was to have any hope of recovering my machine, of returning to my own time, I would need to learn far more about the Eloi and the society they inhabited. The time traveler's voice took on a more determined tone. And so, gentlemen, I embarked on a new phase of my journey, no longer a mere observer, but an active participant in this strange future civilization. He gestured expansively, his eyes alight with the excitement of scientific discovery. I threw myself into learning their language, a surprisingly simple tongue devoid of abstract concepts or complex grammatical structures. I studied their customs, their daily routines, seeking any clue that might lead me to the truth about my machine and the world I found myself in. The psychologist leaned forward, fascinated. "And what did you discover through this immersion?" The time traveler's expression grew thoughtful. "Many things, my friend, some wondrous, some deeply troubling. But perhaps most significantly, I began to perceive the outlines of a mystery far greater than the mere disappearance of my machine." He paused, his gaze becoming distant. "For you see, gentlemen, the more I learned about the Eloi and their world, the more I became convinced that there was something missing, some vital component of a functioning society that was conspicuously absent." The time traveler's voice dropped to a near whisper. Where were the elderly, the infirm? Where was the infrastructure needed to support even this seemingly simple civilization? And most disturbingly, what was the source of the nameless fear that seemed to grip the Eloi when darkness fell? He shook his head slowly. These questions nagged at me, even as I continued my efforts to integrate myself into their society. And as the days passed, I began to form a theory so horrifying, so utterly at odds with our notions of progress and civilization, that I scarcely dared give it voice. The time traveler fell silent, his eyes sweeping across his now rapt audience. The room was hushed, each man grappling with the implications of what they had heard. Finally, the medical man spoke, his voice hesitant. "But surely you found some answers, some explanation for these discrepancies." The time traveler nodded slowly, a grim smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Indeed, my friend. And it was in seeking those answers that I stumbled upon the true horror that lurked beneath the surface of this seeming paradise. A horror that would shake me to my very core and force me to reconsider everything I thought I knew about the nature of progress, of civilization, of humanity itself." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "For you see, gentlemen, the Eloi were not alone in that future world, and the true inheritors of our civilization's legacy were far more terrifying than I could have possibly imagined." As the time traveler prepared to launch into the next phase of his extraordinary tale, the assembled guests leaned forward, their minds reeling with the implications of what they had heard. For in this story of a lost time machine and a stranded explorer, they saw reflected the deepest questions of their own time: the nature of progress, the price of utopia, and the essential qualities that define what it means to be human. The fire crackled softly in the grate, casting dancing shadows across the room. Outside, the night pressed against the windows, a reminder of the vast, mysterious universe that lay beyond. And in that moment, as they waited with bated breath for the time traveler to continue, each man felt a profound sense of wonder and a creeping dread at the possible futures that awaited their species in the vast, uncharted realms of time. The time traveler took a deep breath, steeling himself for the next part of his narrative. "Gentlemen, as I integrated myself into the society of the Eloi, I began to notice patterns, subtle at first, but increasingly impossible to ignore. The Eloi, for all their childlike demeanor and apparent contentment, lived in a state of low-grade fear. As night fell, they would huddle together in their great halls, their eyes wide with an anxiety they seemed unable to articulate." He paused, his gaze sweeping across his rapt audience. "At first, I attributed this to some primordial fear of the dark, a vestigial remnant of our evolutionary past. But as I observed more closely, I realized there was something more, something that spoke of a very real, very present danger." The psychologist leaned forward, intrigued. What sort of danger could exist in such a seemingly idyllic world? The time traveler's expression darkened. "That, my friend, was the question that consumed me. For in all my explorations, I had seen no predators, no natural disasters, nothing that could account for this pervasive sense of threat. and yet the fear was undeniably real. He began to pace again, his voice taking on a more urgent tone. It was on my third night in that future world that I first heard the sounds. Faint at first, barely distinguishable from the rustle of wind through the strange vegetation. But as I listened more closely, I realized they were footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, moving with purpose through the darkness. The time traveler paused, allowing the tension to build before continuing. I tried to follow the sound, to catch a glimpse of whatever was moving in the shadows. But each time I drew near, the footsteps would fade away, leaving me with nothing but the pounding of my own heart and a growing sense of unease. He shook his head slowly, his eyes distant with the memory. It was then that I began to piece together a theory so horrifying, so utterly at odds with our notions of progress and civilization, that I scarcely dared give it voice. The time traveler's gaze focused once more on his audience, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Gentlemen, consider the world of the Eloi as I had observed it. A paradise of abundance, free from struggle or hardship. A population of beautiful childlike beings, lacking in intellect or ambition. And yet a world marked by an inexplicable fear, by the mysterious disappearance of individuals, by sounds in the night that spoke of something other. He paused, allowing his words to sink in before continuing. What if, I asked myself, this was not the whole picture? What if the Eloi were not the sole inheritors of our civilization's legacy? What if there was another group, hidden from view, that played a role in this future ecosystem? The editor couldn't contain himself any longer. Out with it, man. What are you suggesting? The time traveler fixed him with a steady gaze. I am suggesting, my friends, that in our relentless pursuit of progress, of comfort and ease, we may have set in motion a chain of events that led to the bifurcation of our species. That the Eloi, in all their beauty and simplicity, were but one half of a symbiotic relationship, a relationship as terrible as it was inevitable. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for the revelation. For you see, gentlemen, I believe that lurking beneath the surface of this seeming paradise, there exists another race. A race born of the same evolutionary pressures that shaped the Eloi, but adapted to a very different niche. A race that embodies all the darker aspects of our nature, our cunning, our predatory instincts, our capacity for calculated cruelty. The room fell silent as the implications of his words sank in. The medical man was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. My God, you're suggesting some kind of subterranean species, preying on the Eloi. The time traveler nodded grimly. Precisely. A nocturnal race, adapted to life underground, emerging under cover of darkness to harvest the Eloi. A perfect ecological balance, you might say, if one can use such a term to describe something so utterly horrifying. He began to pace again, his voice taking on a more analytical tone. Think of it, gentlemen, the logical endpoint of the social stratification we see in our own time. The division between those who labor and those who benefit from that labor, taken to its ultimate extreme. The Eloi, descendants of the leisure class, bred for beauty and docility. And these others, let us call them Morlocks, the descendants of the working class, driven underground by some long-forgotten cataclysm, evolving into something other. The time traveler paused, his eyes sweeping across his now silent audience. It is a hypothesis only, of course, but one that fits the observable facts. The fear of the Eloi, their clustering together at night. The sounds in the darkness, the mysterious disappearances, and most tellingly, their reaction to my attempts to open the pedestal of the Sphinx, a reaction that spoke not just of fear, but of deeply ingrained conditioning. He shook his head slowly, his voice tinged with a mixture of awe and horror. Imagine it, gentlemen, a society so perfectly balanced, so exquisitely adapted, that it has persisted for countless millennia. The Eloi living their lives of idle pleasure, bred and culled like cattle. The Morlocks, tending to the machinery that keeps this twisted paradise functioning, emerging at night to collect their grisly tribute. The time traveler fell silent, allowing the full weight of his theory to settle over the room. The assembled guests exchanged uneasy glances, each grappling with the implications of what they had heard. Finally, the psychologist spoke, his voice hesitant. But surely this is mere speculation. You have no concrete evidence of these Morlocks. The time traveler's eyes gleamed with a mixture of excitement and dread. Evidence, my friend? Oh, I have evidence. For in my attempts to unravel this mystery, to find my lost time machine, I ventured into the depths of their underground realm. And what I discovered there, well, that is a tale that will shake you to your very core. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. For you see, gentlemen, in the lightless caverns beneath the world of the Eloi, I came face to face with the true inheritors of our civilization's legacy, and in that moment I understood the full horror of what humanity might become. As the time traveler prepared to launch into the next phase of his extraordinary tale, the assembled guests leaned forward, their minds reeling with the implications of what they had heard. For in this story of a bifurcated future, they saw reflected the deepest fears and contradictions of their own time, the price of progress, the nature of humanity, and the potential consequences of unchecked social stratification. The fire crackled softly in the grate, casting dancing shadows across the room. Outside, the night pressed against the windows, suddenly seeming more ominous, more pregnant with unseen threats. And in that moment, as they waited with bated breath for the time traveler to continue, each man felt a profound sense of unease, a creeping dread at the possible futures that awaited their species in the vast, uncharted realms of time. Chapter 8. The Bifurcation of Man, a Tale of Above and Below. The time traveler paused in his narration, his eyes distant, as he recalled the moment when the true nature of the future world began to reveal itself. The assembled guests leaned forward, their skepticism momentarily forgotten, in the face of such a vivid tale. Gentlemen, he began, his voice low and intense, imagine, if you will, a world of breathtaking beauty and abundance, where every need seems to be met without effort or strife. A paradise, one might think. And yet, lurking beneath this idyllic surface, I began to perceive the outlines of a mystery far more profound and far more disturbing than I could have possibly imagined. He closed his eyes for a moment, as if reliving the scene. As I explored the landscape, I was struck by the juxtaposition of natural beauty and architectural marvels. Lush forests and flowering meadows stretched as far as the eye could see, interspersed with magnificent structures that seemed to defy the ravages of time. But it was the wells that first caught my attention. Deep, circular shafts, rimmed with bronze and protected by elegant cupolas. The time traveler's eyes snapped open, filled with a mixture of wonder and unease. These wells, gentlemen, were no mere sources of water. As I approached, I could feel a strong current of air emanating from their depths, accompanied by a rhythmic thudding sound that seemed to pulse through the very ground beneath my feet. He paused, allowing the tension to build before continuing. It was then that I began to formulate a theory, one that would soon be shaken to its very foundations. These wells, I reasoned, must be part of some vast subterranean ventilation system, perhaps serving the machinery that sustained this seemingly effortless utopia. The psychologist leaned forward, intrigued. But surely such a system would require maintenance, engineers to oversee its operation. The time traveler nodded grimly. Precisely, and therein lay the first of many contradictions that would come to haunt me. For in all my observations of the Eloi, these delicate, childlike beings, I saw no evidence of labor, no sign of the practical knowledge or skills needed to maintain such a complex infrastructure. He began to pace, his voice taking on a more animated tone. Consider, gentlemen, the sheer scope of what would be required to sustain even the most basic aspects of a civilization. Sanitation, transportation, the production of food and goods, all these necessities seemed to be met, and yet I could find no workshops, no factories, no farms. It was as if the very concept of work had been forgotten, lost to the mists of time. The time traveler's expression darkened. And it was not only industry that was absent. As I studied the Eloi more closely, I realized that there were no aged among them, no infirm. Every individual I encountered was the picture of youth and vitality. It was unnatural. He shook his head slowly, bewilderment clear in his voice. My initial theories of an automated civilization, of a humanity grown decadent through lack of struggle, began to crumble. For even in a world of perfect abundance, surely there would be some who sought knowledge, who burned with curiosity about their world and its workings. And yet the Eloi seemed utterly content in their ignorance, showing no interest in the hows and whys of their existence. The editor couldn't contain himself any longer. But surely there must have been some explanation, some hidden aspect of their society that you had yet to uncover? The time traveler fixed him with a steady gaze. Indeed, my friend, and it was in seeking that explanation that I stumbled upon a truth far more terrifying than anything I could have imagined. He paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing. It began with Weena. I found her drowning in a swift-flowing river, her delicate form no match for the current. Without thinking, I plunged in to save her, an act that seemed to astonish the other Eloi watching from the shore. The time traveler's voice softened, a note of genuine affection creeping in. Weena's gratitude was touching. She adorned me with a garland of strange, sweet-smelling flowers, and from that moment on, she became my constant companion. In her, I found a measure of comfort in this alien world, a connection to these beings I was struggling to understand. His expression grew troubled, but it was Weena who first gave me a glimpse of the darkness that lurked beneath the surface of this seeming paradise. As night fell, I noticed a change come over her, a tensing of her small frame, a widening of her eyes as she stared into the gathering shadows. And she was not alone in her fear. The time traveler's voice dropped to a near whisper. I watched as the Eloi gathered in their great houses at nightfall, huddling together like children frightened of the dark. But what could inspire such terror in a world seemingly devoid of predators or natural threats? He began to pace again, his words coming faster now. It was on a restless night, as I wandered the ruins of some ancient structure, that I caught my first glimpse of the truth. In the half-light, I saw figures moving ape-like forms that scuttled through the shadows with a quickness that made my blood run cold. At first, I dismissed them as tricks of the light, phantoms conjured by my overwrought imagination. The time traveler paused, his gaze sweeping across his now rapt audience. But then, gentlemen, I saw one clearly, a pale, nocturnal creature with large, luminous eyes that reflected the moonlight like a cat's. It was undeniably real, undeniably other. He shook his head slowly, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and horror. In that moment, a theory began to form in my mind. A theory so radical, so utterly at odds with our understanding of human evolution that I scarcely dared give it voice. What if, I asked myself, humanity had not simply evolved into the Eloi? What if our species had, over countless millennia, bifurcated? The room fell silent as the implications of his words sank in. The medical man was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. Bifurcated? You mean two distinct species? The time traveler nodded grimly. Precisely. The Eloi, beautiful and childlike, living in their sunlit world of abundance. And these others, let us call them Morlocks, adapted to life in the darkness below. Two branches of the human tree, shaped by unimaginable spans of time and radically different environmental pressures. He began to pace again, his voice taking on a more analytical tone. Consider the evidence, gentlemen. The wells, clearly connected to some vast underground complex. The fear of darkness that grips the Eloi. The absence of any visible means of production or maintenance in their world. It all points to a symbiotic relationship between these two species, a relationship as terrible as it is fascinating from an evolutionary standpoint. The time traveler paused, allowing his words to sink in before continuing. I believe that the Morlocks are the true inheritors of our industrial legacy. Living in the tunnels and caverns beneath the surface, they tend to the machinery that keeps this twisted paradise functioning. And in return, he trailed off, his expression haunted. The psychologist leaned forward, his voice urgent. In return, what? The time traveler's eyes met his, filled with a mixture of horror and grim fascination. In return, my friends, I fear they harvest the Eloi, a perfect ecological balance, you might say, if one can use such a term to describe something so utterly abhorrent. The room erupted in a chorus of disbelief and horror. The editor's face was pale as he sputtered, But that's monstrous. Surely you can't believe that humanity could devolve into such a state." The time traveler held up a hand, silencing the outcry. "Devolve? No, my friend. This is not devolution, but adaptation taken to its logical extreme. The Eloi, descendants of the leisure class, bred for beauty and docility over countless generations. The Morlocks, driven underground by some long-forgotten cataclysm, evolving to thrive in the darkness." He shook his head slowly, his voice tinged with a mixture of awe and despair. "It is a horrifying thought, yes, but consider the elegance of it from a purely biological perspective. A closed ecosystem, perfectly balanced, persisting for millennia. The Eloi, living their lives of idle pleasure, bred and culled like cattle. The Morlocks, maintaining the machinery of civilization, emerging at night to collect their grisly tribute." The time traveler fell silent, his eyes sweeping across his now silent audience. The room was hushed, each man grappling with the implications of what they had heard. Finally, the psychologist spoke, his voice hesitant. "But surely there must be more to it. Some aspect of this future world that you hadn't yet discovered." The time traveler nodded slowly, a grim smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Indeed, my friend. For you see, it was this realization that spurred me to more daring explorations. I became determined to uncover the full truth of this bifurcated future, and to find my lost time machine, which I now suspected had been taken by the Morlocks." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "And so, gentlemen, I ventured into the depths of their underground realm. What I discovered there, well, that is a tale that will shake you to your very core." As the time traveler prepared to launch into the next phase of his extraordinary narrative, the assembled guests leaned forward, their minds reeling with the implications of what they had heard. For in this story of a divided humanity, they saw reflected the deepest fears and contradictions of their own time, the price of progress, the nature of civilization, and the potential consequences of unchecked social stratification. The fire crackled softly in the grate, casting dancing shadows across the room. Outside, the night pressed against the windows, suddenly seeming more ominous, more pregnant with unseen threats. And in that moment, as they waited with bated breath for the time traveler to continue, each man felt a profound sense of unease, a creeping dread at the possible futures that awaited their species in the vast, uncharted realms of time. Chapter 9: The Morlocks. The time traveler paused in his narration, his eyes distant and haunted, as he prepared to recount his harrowing journey into the depths of the earth. The assembled guests leaned forward, their skepticism long forgotten, replaced by a mixture of fascination and dread. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "I stand before you now as a man who has gazed into the abyss of our species' potential future. What I encountered in the lightless caverns beneath the Eloi's world has shaken me to my very core, challenging everything I thought I knew about the nature of humanity and the inexorable march of evolution." He closed his eyes for a moment, steeling himself against the flood of memories. When he spoke again, his voice was stronger, tinged with a clinical detachment that barely masked the underlying horror. "My descent into that subterranean realm was not undertaken lightly. The very thought of the Morlocks filled me with a revulsion so profound it bordered on the existential. Their pallid, worm-like bodies, glimpsed in the half-light of the ruins, haunted my dreams. The idea that these creatures could be our descendants, the end result of millions of years of evolution, was almost too terrible to contemplate." The time traveler's eyes snapped open, fixing each of his listeners with an intense gaze. "And yet, gentlemen, it was precisely this horror that drove me forward. For in the Morlocks, I sensed the key to understanding this bifurcated future, and perhaps to recovering my lost time machine." He began to pace, his words coming faster now, driven by the urgency of recollection. I spent days exploring the surface world, pushing ever further from the Sphinx that I suspected housed my machine. In the distance, I spied a colossal structure of green porcelain, its architecture hinting at some fusion of Oriental and Western styles that spoke of millennia of cultural evolution. But exhaustion and the growing weight of my mission forced me to postpone its exploration. The time traveler paused, his expression darkening. It was on the third day that I finally mustered the courage to descend into one of the wells. Little Weena, bless her gentle soul, accompanied me to the edge. Her distress as I prepared to climb down was palpable, her small hands clutching at my clothes as if to physically restrain me from this folly. His voice softened, a note of genuine affection creeping in. In that moment, I was struck by the profound bond that had formed between us. Here was a being separated from me by an unfathomable gulf of time and evolution, and yet her concern, her emotional attachment, was unmistakably human. The medical man leaned forward, his professional curiosity piqued. But surely the physical differences between you and the Eloi must have been significant. After so many millennia of evolution, the time traveler nodded thoughtfully. Indeed, and therein lies one of the great mysteries of this future world. The Eloi, for all their delicate beauty, were recognizably human. Their evolutionary changes seem to be largely a matter of degree, a refinement of form, rather than a fundamental restructuring. It was as if natural selection had been suspended, or perhaps redirected, towards purely aesthetic ends. He shook his head, refocusing on his narrative. But I digress. Steeling myself against Weena's silent pleas, I began my descent into the well. The shaft was deep. I estimate some 200 yards at least, lined with metal bars that served as a ladder. The climb was grueling, each movement a battle against fatigue and the ever-present fear of falling. The time traveler's voice took on a more urgent tone as he continued. As I descended, the quality of the air changed. The fresh breeze from above gave way to a stagnant, humid atmosphere that seemed to cling to my skin. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the faint glimmer of light from the wells opening far above. He paused, his eyes distant, as he relived the memory. It was in that darkness that I first truly encountered the Morlocks. I had reached a narrow tunnel branching off from the main shaft and paused to rest. Suddenly, I sensed movement in the blackness. Striking a match, I found myself face to face with three of the creatures. The time traveler's voice dropped to a near whisper, filled with a mixture of fascination and revulsion. They were grotesque, gentlemen. Imagine, if you will, a human form distorted by eons of subterranean existence. Their skin was a pallid grey, almost translucent, with a texture that reminded me of the slimy flesh of cave-dwelling amphibians. Their eyes, adapted to the perpetual darkness, were enormous and seemed to glow with a faint, unsettling luminescence. He shuddered visibly at the recollection, but it was their behavior that truly unnerved me. They recoiled from the light of my match with a speed that spoke of generations of light sensitivity. Yet their retreat was not one of fear, but of calculation. I could sense their presence in the darkness, circling, probing, waiting for the light to fade. The psychologist leaned forward, his voice hushed. And what of their intelligence? Could you gauge their level of cognition? The time traveler's expression grew troubled. That, my friend, is a question that has haunted me ever since. Their actions bespoke a certain cunning, a predatory intelligence that was unmistakably purposeful. And yet, there was something fundamentally alien about their thought processes, something that defied easy categorization. He began to pace again, his words coming faster as he delved deeper into his recollections. As I ventured further into their realm, I was struck by the vastness of the underground complex. Enormous chambers stretched into the darkness, filled with machinery of mind-boggling complexity. The air thrummed with the pulsing of hidden engines, the very bedrock seeming to vibrate with barely contained power. The time traveler paused, his expression darkening. And everywhere, gentlemen, everywhere was the smell. A cloying metallic odor that I recognized with a jolt of horror. The unmistakable scent of blood. The room fell silent as the implications of his words sank in. The editor, his face pale, was the first to speak. "You mean to say, these creatures, these Morlocks, they were carnivorous?" The time traveler nodded grimly. "More than that, my friend. I believe they had evolved to prey upon the Eloi. A perfect closed ecosystem, you might say, if one can use such a term to describe something so utterly abhorrent." He shook his head as if trying to dispel the memory. But it was what happened next that truly tested the limits of my sanity. As I stood there, frozen in horror at the realization of what the Morlocks truly were, I felt touch. In the absolute darkness, they had crept up on me, their cold, clammy hands exploring my body with a curiosity that was somehow more terrifying than outright aggression. The time traveler's voice grew hoarse as he continued. I lashed out blindly, striking matches and swinging my makeshift club in a frenzy of panic. The Morlocks retreated from the light, but I could hear them in the darkness, chittering and moving with that uncanny speed. It was a nightmare of strobe-like flashes, glimpses of pale flesh and gleaming eyes, the constant fear of what might be lurking just beyond the circle of light. He paused, swallowing hard before continuing. I'm not ashamed to admit that in that moment, I was overcome by terror. All scientific curiosity, all thoughts of my lost time machine were obliterated by the primal need to escape. I fled back towards the shaft, the sound of pursuing Morlocks echoing in my ears. The time traveler's voice dropped to a near whisper. The climb back to the surface was agonizing. Every muscle screamed in protest, my lungs burning as I gasped for air. And all the while, I could sense the Morlocks below, waiting in the darkness, their pale hands reaching up towards me. He closed his eyes, reliving the moment. When I finally emerged into the sunlight, I collapsed on the grass, my mind reeling from what I had experienced. Weena was there, her small hands touching my face with a gentleness that seemed to anchor me to reality. Other Eloi gathered around, their expressions a mixture of concern and incomprehension. The time traveler fell silent, his eyes sweeping across his now rapt audience. The room was hushed, each man grappling with the implications of what they had heard. Finally, the medical man spoke, his voice hesitant. But what does it all mean? How could humanity have split into such divergent forms?" The time traveler's eyes snapped open, filled with a fierce intensity. "That, my friends, is the question that has consumed me ever since. For in the Morlocks and the Eloi, I believe we see the ultimate consequences of our own society's trajectory. The increasing stratification between the privileged and the laboring classes, taken to its logical extreme over millions of years of divergent evolution." He began to pace again, his voice taking on a more lecturing tone. "Consider the forces at play, gentlemen. The Eloi, descendants of the leisure class, bred for beauty and docility in a world where all needs are met effortlessly. And the Morlocks, driven underground by some long-forgotten cataclysm, adapting to a lightless world of machinery and predation." The time traveler paused, allowing his words to sink in before continuing. "It is a horrifying thought, yes, but consider the elegance of it from a purely biological perspective. A closed ecosystem, perfectly balanced, persisting for millennia. The Eloi, living their lives of idle pleasure, bred and culled like cattle. The Morlocks, maintaining the machinery of civilization, emerging at night to collect their grisly tribute." He shook his head slowly, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and despair. "And yet, for all its horror, I cannot help but marvel at the sheer scope of evolutionary adaptation on display. The Morlocks' eyes, enlarged and sensitive to the infrared spectrum, allowing them to navigate in total darkness. Their pale skin, likely capable of synthesizing vital nutrients in the absence of sunlight. Their enhanced strength and speed, necessary for survival in their harsh underground environment." The time traveler's gaze swept across his audience, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "But perhaps most fascinating and most terrible is the evolution of their cognitive abilities. For the Morlocks are not mindless beasts, gentlemen. They are tool users, maintainers of complex machinery. Their predation upon the Eloi is not mere animal hunger. but a carefully managed system of husbandry. He fell silent, allowing the full weight of his words to settle over the room. The assembled guests exchanged uneasy glances, each grappling with the implications of what they had heard. Finally, the psychologist spoke, his voice hesitant. But surely there must be more to it. Some aspect of this future world that offers hope, that suggests a way to prevent such a horrifying outcome. The time traveler nodded slowly, a grim smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Indeed, my friend, for you see my journey into the Morlock's realm was but the beginning. What I discovered in the days that followed, about the true nature of the Eloi-Morlock relationship, about the fate of my time machine, and about the ultimate destiny of our species. Well, that is a tale that will challenge everything you think you know about the nature of time, evolution, and the very fabric of reality itself. As the time traveler prepared to launch into the next phase of his extraordinary narrative, the assembled guests leaned forward, their minds reeling with the implications of what they had heard. For in this story of a divided humanity, they saw reflected the deepest fears and contradictions of their own time. The price of progress, the nature of civilization, and the potential consequences of unchecked social stratification. The fire crackled softly in the grate, casting dancing shadows across the room. Outside, the night pressed against the windows, suddenly seeming more ominous, more pregnant with unseen threats. And in that moment, as they waited with bated breath for the time traveler to continue, each man felt a profound sense of wonder and a creeping dread at the possible futures that awaited their species in the vast, uncharted realms of time. Chapter 10. When Night Came. The time traveler paused in his narration, his eyes distant and haunted, as he prepared to recount the profound shift in his understanding of the future world. The assembled guests leaned forward, their skepticism long forgotten, replaced by a mixture of fascination and dread. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "I stand before you now as a man who has gazed into the abyss of our species' potential future. What I encountered in the lightless caverns beneath the Eloi's world, and the realizations that followed, have shaken me to my very core, challenging everything I thought I knew about the nature of humanity and the inexorable march of evolution." He closed his eyes for a moment, steeling himself against the flood of memories. When he spoke again, his voice was stronger, tinged with a clinical detachment that barely masked the underlying horror. My descent into the Morlock's realm had left me with a sense of dread so profound it bordered on the existential. The realization of their true nature, not mere subterranean dwellers, but active predators of the Eloi, cast a shadow over everything I had observed in this future world. Suddenly, the Eloi's fear of darkness, their childlike demeanor, took on a sinister new meaning. The time traveler's eyes snapped open, fixing each of his listeners with an intense gaze. Imagine, if you will, the horror of it. A species bred for millennia to be docile, to lack any semblance of survival instinct, now serving as livestock for their former servants. For that is what I believe the Morlocks once were, the laboring class, driven underground by some long-forgotten cataclysm, evolving over countless generations into something other. He began to pace, his words coming faster now, driven by the urgency of recollection. The evolutionary implications were staggering. Here, laid bare before me, was the ultimate consequence of social stratification taken to its logical extreme. The Eloi, descendants of the leisure class, had devolved into beautiful childlike beings, utterly incapable of self-preservation. And the Morlocks, the Morlocks had adapted to their harsh subterranean existence with terrifying efficiency. The psychologist leaned forward, fascinated. But surely such extreme divergence would require an immense span of time. How many years into the future had you traveled? The time traveler shook his head slowly. I cannot say with certainty. The chronometer on my machine had registered some 800,000 years, but given the alterations in the Earth's rotational period and orbital mechanics, that figure may be wildly inaccurate. What I can say is that the span of time was sufficient for profound evolutionary changes to occur. He paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing. Consider, gentlemen, the forces at play. Natural selection, that inexorable arbiter of survival, had been radically altered by the artificial conditions created by our own civilization. The Eloi, living in a world of abundance where all needs were met effortlessly, had no environmental pressures to drive adaptation. Their evolution became purely aesthetic, a refinement of form without function. The time traveler's voice took on a more urgent tone. The Morlocks, on the other hand, faced intense selective pressures in their underground realm. Their eyes enlarged, adapted to infrared spectrum to navigate in total darkness. Their skin, likely capable of synthesizing vital nutrients in the absence of sunlight. Their strength and speed enhanced for survival in a harsh environment. And their intellect evolved to maintain the complex machinery that sustained both their world and that of the Eloi above. He fell silent for a moment, allowing the weight of his words to settle over the room. The medical man was the first to speak, his voice hesitant. But if the Morlocks maintained the machinery, why did they not simply overthrow the Eloi? Why this bizarre symbiosis? The time traveler nodded grimly. An excellent question, and one that plagued me as well. I can only theorize that over the vast span of time, a kind of ecological balance had been struck. The Morlocks, adapted to their underground existence, could not simply reclaim the surface world, and the Eloi, in their utter helplessness, had become a managed food source, a grotesque form of animal husbandry on a species-wide scale. He shuddered visibly at the thought. It was this realization that drove me to action. I could no longer view myself as a mere observer in this future world. The Eloi, for all their alienness, were still recognizably human, and in Weena I had found a connection, a being capable of genuine affection and concern, however childlike in its expression. The time traveler's voice softened as he spoke of Weena. She had become my constant companion, her presence a reminder of the humanity that still lingered in this bifurcated future. And it was for her sake, as much as my own, that I resolved to find a means of protection against the Morlocks. He began to pace again, his words taking on a more determined tone. I decided that our best hope lay in reaching the palace of green porcelain, that vast structure I had glimpsed in the distance. Its size and apparent solidity offered the promise of shelter, and perhaps even resources that could be fashioned into weapons. The editor, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, spoke up. Weapons? Against creatures adapted to life underground? Surely fire would be your best defense. The time traveler nodded approvingly. Indeed, and that was foremost in my mind. But creating fire in a world where even the concept seemed to have been forgotten was no small challenge. I hoped that the palace might contain materials that could be used for that purpose. He paused, his expression growing more somber. The journey to the palace was harrowing. We set out at dawn, Weena and I, knowing that we had to cover as much ground as possible before nightfall. The landscape was beautiful, a verdant paradise that seemed to mock the horrors lurking beneath its surface. Weena flitted about, delighting in the strange flowers and fruits we encountered, her joy a stark contrast to the dread that gnawed at my heart. The time traveler's voice took on a more wistful tone. As we walked, I found myself marveling at the altered flora and fauna. 800 millennia of evolution had produced plants and animals that were at once familiar and utterly alien. Massive flowers with iridescent petals that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. Creatures that defied easy classification, blending characteristics of multiple modern species in ways that spoke of radical environmental changes over the vast span of time. He shook his head, refocusing on his narrative. But it was the approach of night that truly filled me with terror. As the sun began to sink towards the horizon, I realized we would not reach the palace before darkness fell. The thought of spending a night in the open, exposed to the predations of the Morlocks, was almost unbearable. The time traveler's voice dropped to a near whisper, filled with a mixture of awe and dread. We made camp on an open hillside, reasoning that it would offer better visibility than the dense woods nearby. And as night fell, I witnessed a sight that drove home the vast gulf of time separating me from my own era. He gestured expansively, his eyes taking on a distant look. The stars, gentlemen, the very constellations had changed. 800,000 years of the Earth's precession had altered the night sky in ways that left me feeling utterly, profoundly alone. Polaris was no longer the North Star. The familiar patterns of Orion, Ursa Major, Cassiopeia, all were distorted, their stars having moved in their stately dance across the cosmos. The time traveler fell silent for a moment, lost in the memory. The psychologist leaned forward, his voice hushed. It must have been overwhelming to see such tangible evidence of the passage of time. Overwhelming indeed, the time traveler agreed. And yet, in that moment of cosmic perspective, I found a strange sort of comfort. For in the face of such vast spans of time, the bifurcation of humanity into Eloi and Morlock seemed transient, a mere blip in the grand tapestry of evolution. He shook his head, his expression hardening. But such philosophical musings were a luxury I could ill afford. As the darkness deepened, I became acutely aware of the dangers lurking in the shadows. Every rustle of wind through the grass, every faint sound from the woods below, sent a jolt of fear through my body. The time traveler's voice took on a more urgent tone. It was then, huddled on that hillside with Wiener's small form pressed against me for warmth, that I truly grasped the horror of the Eloi's existence. To live in perpetual fear, knowing that the darkness brought with it the threat of being taken, consumed by creatures that were once your own kind. It was a fate too terrible to contemplate. He paused, his gaze sweeping across his rapt audience. And yet, gentlemen, in that moment of despair, I found a renewed sense of purpose. I resolved that I would not merely survive in this future world. I would find a way to protect Wiener, to give her and her kind a chance at true life, free from the shadow of the Morlocks. The time traveler's voice grew stronger, filled with determination. As the long night wore on, I began to formulate a plan. We would reach the palace of green porcelain, where I hoped to find materials for weapons and, more importantly, a means of creating fire. With light as our ally, we could hold the Morlocks at bay. He began to pace again, his words coming faster as he outlined his strategy. But that was only the beginning. My ultimate goal remained the recovery of my time machine, which I was now certain lay hidden within the pedestal of the White Sphinx. Armed with the knowledge and tools I hoped to gain from the palace, I would find a way to breach those bronze doors and reclaim my means of escape from this nightmarish future. The time traveler paused, his expression a mixture of resolve and weariness. It was a desperate plan, fraught with dangers I could scarcely imagine. But as I lay there, watching the unfamiliar stars wheel overhead, I knew it was my only hope, not just for my own survival, but for the sake of Wiener and all the Eloi. He fell silent, his eyes sweeping across his now silent audience. The room was hushed, each man grappling with the implications of what they had heard. Finally, the medical man spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. But what happened next? Did you reach the palace? Did you find a way to protect yourselves from the Morlocks? The time traveler's eyes gleamed with a mixture of excitement and dread. Ah, my friend, that is a tale that will challenge everything you think you know about the resilience of the human spirit and the terrible price of knowledge in a world gone mad. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. For you see, gentlemen, what I discovered in the palace of green porcelain and the events that followed would shake me to my very core, forcing me to confront not just the nature of this bifurcated future, but the very essence of what it means to be human in a universe of infinite possibilities and unimaginable horrors. As the time traveler prepared to launch into the next phase of his extraordinary narrative, the assembled guests leaned forward, their minds reeling with the implications of what they had heard. For in this story of a man stranded in a nightmarish future, they saw reflected the deepest questions of their own time: the nature of progress, the price of civilization, and the indomitable spirit of humanity in the face of cosmic indifference. The fire crackled softly in the grate, casting dancing shadows across the room. Outside, the night pressed against the windows, suddenly seeming more ominous. more pregnant with unseen threats. And in that moment, as they waited with bated breath for the time traveler to continue, each man felt a profound sense of wonder and a creeping dread at the possible futures that awaited their species in the vast, uncharted realms of time. Chapter 11. The Palace of Ancient Knowledge. As the golden orb of the sun reached its zenith, casting its radiant beams across the undulating landscape of what was once London, the time traveller and Weena crested a grassy hill. Before them, silhouetted against the azure sky, stood a colossal edifice that seemed to defy the very laws of time itself. This was the Palace of Green Porcelain, a relic of a bygone era that had weathered the relentless assault of millennia. The time traveller paused, his eyes scanning the dilapidated structure with a mixture of awe and scientific curiosity. The building's facade, once a gleaming testament to human craftsmanship, now bore the scars of countless years. Shattered windows gaped like hollow eyes, their frames twisted and warped by the inexorable forces of nature. Sheets of green porcelain, once meticulously fitted to form a seamless exterior, now hung precariously or lay scattered across the overgrown grounds. As they approached, the time traveller's gaze was drawn to the distant horizon, where the familiar contours of Wandsworth and Battersea should have stood. Instead, he was met with the glinting surface of an estuary or creek, its waters lapping gently at unfamiliar shores. The realization of just how profoundly the earth had changed in the intervening years struck him with the force of a physical blow. "Weena," he murmured, his voice carrying a note of reverence, "we stand at the precipice of history. This building, this palace, is a bridge between your world and mine." The Eloi woman looked up at him, her large eyes filled with a mixture of trust and incomprehension. The time traveler felt a surge of protectiveness towards her, a sentiment that surprised him with its intensity. As they drew nearer to the palace, the time traveler's trained eye picked out details that might have escaped a less scientifically inclined observer. The porcelain facade, despite its state of decay, was genuine, a feat of material science that spoke volumes about the technological capabilities of the civilization that had constructed it. Intriguingly, he noted inscriptions etched into the porcelain, their script unfamiliar and tantalizing in its mystery. Quantum etching, he mused aloud, his fingers tracing the indecipherable symbols, or perhaps some form of molecular restructuring. The precision required to inscribe porcelain at this scale, fascinating. With Weena close by his side, the time traveler cautiously entered the palace through a gaping doorway. The musty air that greeted them carried the unmistakable scent of age and decay, tinged with an underlying metallic tang that he couldn't quite place. As their eyes adjusted to the dimmer light within, the true nature of the building revealed itself. They stood in what had once been a grand museum, its cavernous halls filled with a cornucopia of objects from across the span of human history. Dust lay thick upon every surface, a silent blanket that had slowly accumulated over unimaginable stretches of time. The time traveler's heart raced with excitement at the prospect of the knowledge contained within these walls. The central hall, a vast space that stretched far above their heads, was dominated by the towering skeletons of long-extinct creatures. A megatherium, its massive frame a testament to the megafauna that once roamed the earth, stood frozen in an eternal pose. Beside it, the sinuous neck of a brontosaurus arched gracefully, its bones defying gravity in a way that spoke of advanced preservation techniques. "You see, Weena," the time traveler explained, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "These are the remnants of creatures that lived millions of years before even my time. They represent epochs of Earth's history, each bone a record of the planet's ever-changing face." He launched into a detailed explanation of plate tectonics and evolutionary biology, concepts that he knew were far beyond Wiener's comprehension, but which he felt compelled to articulate nonetheless. As he spoke, he noticed signs of decay in the displays around them. Some exhibits, protected by what appeared to be hermetically sealed cases, had fared better than others. The time traveler marveled at the advanced preservation techniques that had allowed these specimens to survive for so long. Their exploration took them through a series of galleries, each one a window into a different aspect of natural history. In the mineralogy section, the time traveler's attention was caught by a substantial block of sulfur, its vibrant yellow a stark contrast to the muted tones around it. His mind, ever racing with possibilities, immediately leapt to the potential for creating gunpowder. However, a thorough search of the nearby displays revealed no trace of the necessary nitrates. As they ventured deeper into the palace, the ambient light grew dimmer, and the air took on a chill that seemed to seep into their very bones. The time traveler found himself in a sloping gallery, its contents hidden in shadow. As his eyes strained to make out shapes in the gloom, he became aware of large, corroded forms looming around them. Machines, he realized, relics of a technological age long past. It was then that he heard it, a faint, rhythmic sound that sent a shiver down his spine. The Morlocks. Even here, in this sanctuary of knowledge, their presence could be felt. The time traveler's mind raced, calculating probabilities and potential outcomes with the cold precision of a computer. "We must be prepared," he whispered to Weena, who huddled close to him, her eyes wide with fear. "Knowledge is power, and in this place we have the opportunity to arm ourselves with both." With this thought firmly in mind, the time traveler approached one of the ancient machines. Its purpose was long forgotten, its function obscured by the ravages of time, but its sturdy construction had endured. With a mix of regret for the destruction of an historical artifact and grim determination, he wrenched a lever free from the machine's control panel. The metal, though corroded, still held a significant weight. It would serve as an effective mace if the need arose. Their path led them to a gallery that stirred something deep within the time traveler's soul. Rows upon rows of decaying books lined the walls, their pages crumbling to dust at the slightest touch. The sight filled him with a profound sense of loss. Each volume represented countless hours of human thought and labor, now reduced to little more than fodder for the elements. "Oh, Weena," he sighed, his voice heavy with emotion, "if only you could understand the wealth of knowledge that surrounds us. These books, they contain the sum total of human experience up to a point. Sciences, philosophies, histories, all lost to time." He picked up a book at random, its cover barely holding together. As he gently opened it, a cloud of dust rose, causing him to sneeze. The pages within were illegible, the ink having long since faded or been consumed by mold. The time traveler felt a deep pang of regret, not just for the loss of knowledge, but for the society that had allowed it to slip away. Their exploration eventually brought them to a chemistry gallery, its shelves still lined with an assortment of bottles and apparatus. It was here that the time traveler made a discovery that caused his heart to leap with joy. A box of matches, somehow preserved through the ages. He held the box reverently, understanding its true value in this world of darkness and Morlocks. "Weena," he exclaimed, his voice trembling with excitement, "do you understand what this means? Fire, Weena. We have the means to create fire." The Eloi woman looked at him blankly, but the time traveler was too elated to notice. His mind was already racing ahead, considering the tactical advantages this discovery provided. Fire was more than just a source of light and warmth. It was a weapon, a tool for survival in this harsh future world. As if to underscore the significance of this find, the time traveler's next discovery was equally fortuitous. A large chunk of camphor. He picked it up, inhaling its pungent aroma with satisfaction. "An excellent candle," he murmured, already envisioning the long-burning flame it would produce. As the day wore on and shadows lengthened across the dusty floors of the palace, the time traveler found his thoughts turning to the approaching night. The sounds of the Morlocks, though distant, served as a constant reminder of the dangers that lurked in the darkness. He knew they couldn't remain in the palace indefinitely. Eventually, they would need to venture out and face whatever awaited them. "We'll spend the night in the open," he decided, speaking as much to himself as to Weena. "A fire will provide protection, light to keep the Morlocks at bay. And with this," he hefted the makeshift mace, "we have a means of defense should they draw too close." As the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, the time traveler and Weena made their way back to the palace entrance. Standing on the threshold between the known and the unknown, between the past and the future, the time traveler felt a surge of confidence. The matches weighed heavily in his pocket, a tangible reminder of the power of human ingenuity. The iron mace in his hand spoke of his determination to survive, to protect not just himself, but the gentle Eloi woman who had become his companion in this strange world. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice firm with resolve, "we retrieve the time machine. Whatever obstacles the Morlocks may place in our path, we now have the means to overcome them." As they stepped out into the cool evening air, the time traveler cast one last glance back at the palace of green porcelain. In the fading light, its dilapidated form seemed to shimmer as if caught between two realities. It stood as a monument to human achievement, a bridge between past and future, a repository of knowledge both preserved and lost. The experience had changed him, the time traveler realized. He had come to this future as a detached observer, a scientist intent on unraveling the mysteries of time. But now, with Weena by his side and the weight of millennia pressing down upon him, he felt a new sense of purpose. He was no longer just an observer. He was a participant in this grand cosmic drama, a guardian of knowledge in a world that had forgotten the value of learning. As night fell and the first stars began to twinkle in the velvet sky, the time traveler set about building a fire. The flames danced merrily, casting flickering shadows across the grass and illuminating Weena's fascinated face. In that moment, surrounded by the remnants of human civilization and facing an uncertain future, the time traveler felt a profound connection to the vast sweep of history. He thought of the countless generations that had lived and died, of the civilizations that had risen and fallen, of the knowledge gained and lost. And he thought of the future, not just his immediate future and the challenge of reclaiming the time machine, but the future of humanity itself. What path would the species take? Would it reclaim its thirst for knowledge, its drive to explore and understand the universe? Or would it continue down the path of division and decline that had led to the Eloi and the Morlocks? As he pondered these weighty questions, the time traveler felt a small hand slip into his own. He looked down to see Weena gazing up at him, her eyes reflecting the firelight. In that moment, he understood that the future was not set in stone. Every action, every choice, had the power to shape the course of history. With renewed determination, the time traveler tightened his grip on the mace and drew Weena closer to the fire's warmth. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now they had this moment, a bubble of light and warmth in the vast darkness of time. And in that moment, the time traveler allowed himself to hope, not just for his own safe return, but for the future of humanity itself. Chapter 12. The Inferno of Time. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the ruins of the palace of green porcelain, the time traveler and Weena set forth on their perilous journey. Their destination, the White Sphinx, where the time machine lay hidden. The fading light painted the sky in hues of crimson and gold, a stark reminder of the inexorable passage of time that had brought them to this moment. The time traveler's mind raced with calculations and theories as they made their way across the undulating landscape. He found himself marveling at the cosmic dance that had shaped this future Earth. The slow drift of continents, the gradual shift of the planet's axis, and the subtle changes in its orbit that had reshaped the very face of the world he once knew. "Weena," he began, his voice tinged with wonder, "do you see how the stars are emerging? Each point of light represents a sun, much like our own, but so inconceivably distant that their light has taken years, centuries even, to reach us. The universe is vast beyond imagining, and yet here we are, you and I, bound by the constraints of time and space, struggling against forces we barely comprehend." The Eloi woman gazed up at him, her large eyes reflecting the first glimmers of starlight. Though she couldn't understand his words, the time traveler felt a profound connection to her in that moment, a bridge across the eons that separated their origins. As they pressed on, the time traveler's scientific mind couldn't help but analyze their surroundings. He noted the composition of the soil beneath their feet, speculating on the geological processes that had shaped it over millennia. The flora that surrounded them bore little resemblance to the plants of his era, and he found himself cataloguing their unique adaptations, leaves designed to maximize photosynthesis in the altered atmospheric conditions, root systems that spoke of a changed hydrological cycle. Their progress was slowed by the time traveler's insistence on gathering materials for a fire. He knew that their survival through the night would depend on the ancient human mastery of flame. As he collected sticks and dried grass, he explained to Weena the chemical processes of combustion, the release of stored solar energy that would provide them with light and warmth. "You see, my dear," he said, his voice growing hoarse from the exertion, "fire is a rapid oxidation process. The carbon in these plant materials will combine with oxygen from the air, releasing energy in the form of heat and light. It's a simple reaction, really, but one that has shaped the course of human history." As night fell in earnest, they found themselves at the edge of a dark forest. The time traveler's keen senses, honed by days in this alien future, detected movement in the shadows behind them. Turning, he saw three crouching figures, Morlocks, their pale forms barely visible in the gathering gloom. A chill ran down his spine as he realized the true nature of their predicament. They were prey, being hunted by creatures that had evolved to excel in darkness. The cosmic irony of the situation was not lost on him. Humanity, once the apex predator of Earth, now reduced to fleeing from its own divergent offspring. Making a split-second decision, the time traveler decided to light the gathered firewood. As the flames leapt to life, he found himself mesmerized by the dance of photons, the release of energy that had been captured by photosynthesis eons ago. Weena, too, was fascinated by the fire, her instinctive fear of the dark warring with an almost primal attraction to the light. "No, Weena," he said gently, restraining her as she reached towards the flames. "Fire gives life, but it can also take it away. We must respect its power, use it wisely." They ventured deeper into the forest, the fire illuminating their path initially. The time traveler's mind, usually so ordered and logical, began to feel the effects of fatigue and the strange feverish quality that had plagued him since arriving in this era. He found himself pondering the nature of time itself. Was it truly linear, or were there branches, alternate realities splitting off at every decision point? The Morlocks, emboldened by the darkness, continued to follow them. The time traveler used his dwindling supply of matches and camphor to ward them off, creating brief flares of light that sent the creatures scurrying back into the shadows. Each match struck was a tiny miracle of human ingenuity. Phosphorus, sesquisulfide, and potassium chlorate combining in a burst of chemical energy. As they pushed on through the forest, Weena's strength began to fail. The time traveler found himself carrying her more often than not, her slight form a reminder of the evolutionary changes that had shaped the Eloi. He marveled at the plasticity of the human genome, capable of producing such diverse offshoots in a mere 800,000 years. It was during one of these moments, with Weena cradled in his arms, that disaster struck. The time traveler, his mind clouded by exhaustion and the alien environment, realized he had lost his bearings. The forest seemed to close in around them, a maze of shadows and unfamiliar forms. Panic, that most primal of emotions, began to well up within him. "Think," he admonished himself. "Apply logic, reason. There must be a way out of this predicament." But even as he sought to rally his scientific mind, he knew that pure intellect might not be enough to save them in this instance. Weena stirred in his arms, then went limp. She had fainted, overcome by fear and exhaustion. The time traveler's heart raced as he realized the full weight of his responsibility. It wasn't just his own life at stake, but that of this gentle creature who had placed her trust in him. With renewed determination, he set about building a fire to encamp for the night. But as he reached for his matches, a horrifying realization dawned. They were gone, lost in the chaos of their flight through the forest. In that moment, surrounded by darkness and the unseen threat of the Morlocks, the time traveler felt more alone than he ever had in his life. The attack, when it came, was swift and terrifying. Pale forms emerged from the shadows, their eyes gleaming with a predatory light that sent shivers down the time traveler's spine. He fought with a ferocity born of desperation, wielding his iron bar like a man possessed. The Morlock's flesh yielded sickeningly to his blows, and he found himself simultaneously repulsed by the violence and exhilarated by the primal struggle for survival. It was in the midst of this frenzied combat that the time traveler became aware of a change in the air. A red glow suffused the forest, accompanied by the acrid smell of burning vegetation. With a start, he realized the source. The fire he had lit to cover their retreat had spread, fanned by the wind, into a conflagration that now threatened to engulf the entire forest. The fire spread with frightening speed, a testament to the dry conditions that must have prevailed in this region. The time traveler watched in awe as the flames leapt from tree to tree, creating a spectacle both beautiful and terrifying. The heat was intense, causing the air to shimmer and distort, creating an almost hallucinatory effect. As the forest burned around them, the time traveler witnessed a remarkable sight. The Morlocks, so fearsome in the darkness, were reduced to pitiful, cowering creatures in the harsh glare of the fire. Their eyes, evolved for the perpetual twilight of their underground realm, were painfully sensitive to the bright light. They stumbled about blindly, their usual grace and predatory skill completely absent. The time traveler found himself transfixed by the scene, his scientific mind analyzing even in the midst of danger. He observed the behavior of the fire, noting how it spread more quickly uphill, how it created its own wind patterns through convection. He marveled at the complex interplay of physics and chemistry that turned a simple oxidation reaction into a force of nature. As dawn approached, painting the smoke-filled sky with surreal hues, the time traveler's thoughts turned to Weena. In the chaos of the fire and the Morlock attack, they had become separated. His heart heavy with dread, he began to search the charred landscape, calling her name until his voice grew hoarse. But there was no sign of the gentle Eloy woman. As the full light of day revealed the extent of the destruction, the time traveler was forced to confront a harsh reality. Weena had most likely perished in the inferno. The thought filled him with a profound sense of loss and guilt. She had trusted him, depended on him, and he had failed to protect her. Exhausted, heartbroken, and bearing the wounds of his encounter with the Morlocks, the time traveler turned his steps towards the White Sphinx. He moved as if in a daze, his brilliant mind struggling to process the events of the night. The forest fire had reshaped the landscape, leaving behind a blackened wasteland that seemed to mirror his own sense of desolation. As he limped onward, the time traveler's hand brushed against something in his pocket. To his astonishment, he discovered a few remaining matches, overlooked in his earlier panic. The discovery sparked a renewed sense of hope within him. These tiny sticks of wood and chemicals represented more than just a means of making fire. They were a tangible link to his own time, to the world of science and progress that he had left behind. Holding the matches carefully, the time traveler felt a surge of determination. He had come too far, endured too much, to give up now. The loss of Weena was a wound that would take time to heal, but he knew that the best way to honor her memory was to continue his quest, to unravel the mysteries of this future world and perhaps find a way to change the course of history. As he approached the White Sphinx, its pale form shimmering in the heat haze, the time traveler reflected on the events that had brought him to this point. He had embarked on this journey seeking knowledge, driven by scientific curiosity and a desire to unlock the secrets of time itself. But his experiences in this future world had taught him something far more profound than any scientific principle. He had learned the true meaning of humanity, not as an abstract concept, but as a lived experience. Through his interactions with Weena and his struggles against the Morlocks, he had rediscovered the importance of compassion, bravery, and the unbreakable bonds that can form between individuals, even across the vast gulf of time. The White Sphinx loomed before him, a silent sentinel guarding the secret of his time machine. As he prepared to face whatever challenges lay ahead, the time traveler felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. He had been changed by his journey, shaped by the crucible of this alien future. Whatever the outcome, he knew that he would carry these experiences with him always, a testament to the enduring spirit of human curiosity and resilience. With a deep breath, the time traveler stepped forward, ready to face the final chapter of his extraordinary adventure. The matches in his pocket were a comforting weight, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, a small spark of hope can illuminate the way forward. As he approached the entrance to the Sphinx, he allowed himself a small smile. The journey wasn't over yet, and who knew what wonders or terrors still awaited him in the labyrinth of time. The escape from time's abyss, as the golden rays of the morning sun pierced through the haze of the distant future, the time traveler found himself approaching the familiar seat of yellow metal. The landscape around him, once a source of wonder and fascination, now seemed to mock him with its deceptive beauty. He laughed bitterly, the sound echoing across the empty expanse as he reflected on his initial conclusions about this world. How naive I was, he mused aloud, his voice tinged with a mixture of exhaustion and newfound wisdom. To think that I could unravel the mysteries of 800,000 years of human evolution in a matter of days. The time traveler's keen scientific mind, honed by years of study and experimentation, now turned its full attention to the true nature of this future society. The superficial beauty of the overworld, with its lush gardens and elegant Eloi, masked a dark and terrible truth. Below the surface, in the lightless depths of the underworld, lurked the Morlocks, the other half of this twisted equation of human evolution. As he contemplated the vast sweep of time that had led to this moment, the time traveler found himself grappling with concepts that stretched the very limits of his understanding. He thought of the cosmic forces that had shaped the Earth over eons, the slow dance of plate tectonics, the subtle shifts in the planet's orbit and axial tilt, the gradual changes in atmospheric composition. All of these factors, operating over timescales almost beyond comprehension, had contributed to the world he now found himself in. The human intellect, he said softly, addressing the empty air as if lecturing to an invisible audience, that brief and luminous dream in the vast darkness of time, how quickly it consumed itself in the pursuit of comfort and ease. He recognized now the tragic irony of human progress. The very drive that had propelled his species to greatness, the relentless pursuit of knowledge and mastery over nature, had ultimately led to its downfall. The Eloi and the Morlocks were living proof of the dangers of unchecked technological advancement, divorced from wisdom and foresight. The time traveler's mind, ever analytical, began to piece together the long history that had led to this point. He envisioned the gradual stratification of society, the widening gap between the privileged and the laborers. Over countless generations, this divide had become literally physical, with one group adapting to a life of leisure above ground, while the other evolved to suit the demands of subterranean existence. At first, he theorized, it must have been a symbiotic relationship, the Eloi with their advanced intellect, directing the labor of the Morlocks. But over time, as the Eloi's minds atrophied from lack of use and the Morlocks' bodies adapted to their underground environment, the balance shifted. He shuddered as he contemplated the final, horrific transformation of this relationship. The Morlocks, once subservient, had become the true masters of this world. The Eloi, for all their ethereal beauty, were nothing more than cattle, raised and harvested by their former servants. The weight of this realization, coupled with his physical and emotional exhaustion from the harrowing night in the burning forest, overwhelmed the time traveler. He sank onto the yellow metal seat, his body surrendering to the need for rest, even as his mind continued to race with theories and calculations. As he drifted off to sleep, lulled by the warmth of the sun and the deceptive tranquility of his surroundings, the time traveler's last conscious thoughts were of the vast, uncaring universe. In the grand cosmic scale, what were the trials and tribulations of humanity? A mere blip in the endless expanse of space and time. He awoke with a start as the sun dipped towards the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The approaching darkness brought with it a renewed sense of urgency. The Morlocks would soon emerge from their underground lairs, and he had no desire to face them again without the protection of his time machine. With a mixture of anticipation and dread, the time traveler made his way towards the White Sphinx. As he approached, his heart leapt into his throat. The bronze panels that had sealed the entrance were now open, revealing the dark interior. For a moment, he hesitated on the threshold, his scientific curiosity warring with his instinct for self-preservation. What if this was a trap? But the allure of the time machine, his only means of escape from this nightmarish future, proved too strong to resist. Steeling himself, the time traveler entered the Sphinx. As his eyes adjusted to the gloom, he saw it, the time machine, standing just as he had left it. But something was different. The machine gleamed in the fading light, its brass and ivory components polished to a high sheen. Someone or something had cleaned and oiled it. The Morlocks, he breathed, a chill running down his spine as he realized the implications. These creatures, descendants of humanity yet so alien, had not only moved the time machine, but had apparently attempted to understand and maintain it. As he approached the machine, running his hands over its familiar contours, the time traveler's mind raced with questions. Had the Morlocks grasped the true nature of the device? Were they capable of that level of abstract thought? Or had they simply recognized it as a complex mechanism requiring maintenance? His musings were cut short by a sudden, ominous sound, the grinding of metal on stone as the bronze panels of the Sphinx began to close. Panic seized him as he realized the trap he had willingly walked into. The Morlocks had baited him perfectly, using his own creation as lure. Darkness enveloped him, absolute and oppressive. The time traveler fumbled for his matches, his last line of defense against the night-adapted Morlocks. But to his horror, he found that they would only light on the box. A cruel twist of fate that rendered them almost useless in his current predicament. As the sound of soft padding footsteps reached his ears, the time traveler's scientific mind began to analyze his situation even as his body prepared for fight or flight. He considered the evolutionary adaptations that allowed the Morlocks to navigate in total darkness, enhanced hearing, perhaps, or some form of echolocation. Their eyes, adapted for the dim light of their underground realm, would be painfully sensitive to any sudden illumination. Using this knowledge to his advantage, the time traveler struck his remaining matches in rapid succession, creating brief flashes of light that disoriented the approaching Morlocks. In the momentary illumination, he caught glimpses of pale, ape-like forms recoiling from the sudden brightness. But he knew this was only a temporary solution. With fumbling hands, he began to attach the levers to the time machine, his fingers moving with a combination of muscle memory and desperate need. Each second felt like an eternity as he worked, acutely aware of the Morlocks regrouping in the darkness around him. As he struggled with the machine, the time traveler's mind wandered to the broader implications of his situation. Here he was, a man out of time, fighting for survival against the twisted descendants of his own species. It was a stark reminder of the unpredictable nature of evolution, the way small changes compounded over vast stretches of time could lead to outcomes beyond imagination. Finally, with a satisfying click, the last lever slid into place. The time traveler's hand hovered over the controls, a moment of hesitation gripping him. What if the machine malfunctioned? What if, in their tinkering, the Morlocks had inadvertently damaged some crucial component? But the choice was made for him as he felt cold, clammy hands grasping at his legs. With a cry that was equal parts terror and defiance, he activated the time machine. The familiar sensation of temporal displacement washed over him, a dizzying, nauseating lurch as he was torn from one moment in time and hurled into the tumultuous stream of chronal energy. Through the swirling vortex of past and future, he caught fleeting glimpses of the world outside his machine. Epochs flickered by in the blink of an eye. He saw great cities rise and fall, continents shift and reform, ice ages come and go. The sun pulsed and swelled, its life cycle playing out in fast forward. And through it all, the Earth spun on, a tiny mote in the vast cosmic dance. As he hurtled through time, the time traveler's scientific mind struggled to process the information overload. He observed the effects of stellar evolution, watching as the sun gradually expanded, its outer layers engulfing the inner planets. He witnessed the slow death of the Earth, its oceans boiling away, its atmosphere stripped by the solar wind. And still, the time machine plunged onward, carrying him towards an unknowable future. The time traveler found himself filled with a profound sense of awe and terror. He had set out to explore the mysteries of time, but now he felt like a child adrift in an ocean of cosmic scale. As the wild journey continued, the time traveler's thoughts turned to the lessons he had learned in the world of the Eloi and Morlocks. He saw now the dangers of complacency, the perils of a society that loses its drive for progress and understanding. But he also recognized the risks of unchecked technological advancement, of pursuing knowledge without wisdom. In that moment, suspended between the immensity of deep time and the fleeting nature of human existence, the time traveler made a silent vow. If, when he returned to his own time, he would dedicate himself to steering humanity towards a better path, one that balanced progress with compassion, technological advancement with ethical consideration. The time machine began to slow, the kaleidoscopic blur of passing time resolving into more distinct images. The time traveler steeled himself, unsure of what new wonders or horrors awaited him at his next destination. As the machine finally came to a stop, the time traveler found himself once again surrounded by the grey, tumultuous environment he had first encountered on his journey through time. But now, armed with the knowledge and experiences of his extraordinary adventure, he faced this alien landscape with a newfound determination. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever secrets the vast expanse of time still held, the time traveler was ready to face them, for he had glimpsed the cosmic tapestry of existence, had seen the rise and fall of his own species played out across eons. And in doing so, he had gained a perspective that transcended the narrow confines of any single era. As he stepped out of the time machine, ready to explore this new point in Earth's history, the time traveler carried with him not just the weight of his recent experiences, but the hope for a future that humanity might yet create. A future built on understanding, compassion, and the relentless pursuit of knowledge tempered by wisdom. Chapter 14. The Twilight of Earth. The time traveler's grip tightened on the levers of his machine as he hurtled through the fourth dimension, his body racked by waves of nausea and disorientation. The improper seating on his temporal conveyance exacerbated the already discomforting effects of chronal displacement, causing his perceptions to spiral and fragment like shards of a shattered mirror. As his journey continued, the time traveler's scientific mind struggled to make sense of the kaleidoscopic blur of images rushing past. He realized with a start that instead of reversing course as he had intended, he was plunging ever deeper into the future. The chronometer on his machine spun wildly, marking the passage of not just years or centuries, but millions of days. "Fascinating," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the strange, otherworldly hum of the time machine. "The relativistic effects of temporal displacement are far more pronounced than I had anticipated. Einstein's theories on the malleability of space-time are being confirmed before my very eyes." As he steadied himself, focusing his attention on the world beyond the protective bubble of his machine, the time traveler began to notice profound changes in the Earth's appearance. The familiar palpitating grayness that had marked his initial forays into time travel began to darken, taking on an ominous quality that sent a shiver down his spine. The alternation of day and night, once a comforting rhythm that had defined human existence for millennia, began to slow. The time traveler watched in awe as the sun's arc across the sky became more languid, stretching out over what must have been weeks or even months in the old reckoning of time. The Earth's rotation, he mused, his scientific curiosity momentarily overriding his growing sense of unease. It's slowing down, likely due to tidal forces exerted by the moon. But at this rate, the effect is far more pronounced than our current models would predict. What other factors could be at play? As millions of years rushed by in the blink of an eye, twilight began to envelop the Earth. The sun, once a brilliant yellow orb, transformed into a bloated red dome that hung motionless on the horizon. The time traveler's mind raced with calculations, trying to reconcile this observation with his knowledge of stellar evolution. The sun has entered its red giant phase, he realized, a mix of wonder and horror coloring his thoughts. Its core hydrogen depleted, it's now fusing helium, causing its outer layers to expand. But this shouldn't be happening for billions of years. Has some cosmic catastrophe accelerated the process? The stars, those eternal beacons that had guided humanity since time immemorial, now appeared as creeping points of light, their movements perceptible even to the naked eye. The time traveler understood that he was witnessing the slow dance of galactic rotation, compressed into a time frame comprehensible to human perception. Unable to bear the vertigo-inducing spectacle any longer, the time traveler brought his machine to a halt on what appeared to be a desolate beach. As he stepped out onto the sand, he was struck by the alien quality of his surroundings. The sky above was a deep, angry red, reminiscent of the skies of Mars as depicted in the pulp science fiction of his era. Vegetation, strange and green, clung tenaciously to the rocks that jutted out from the shoreline. The atmosphere hit him like a physical blow. It was thin and harsh, reminiscent of the air at extreme altitudes. The time traveler found himself gasping for breath, his lungs straining to extract sufficient oxygen from the rarefied air. "The atmosphere has changed dramatically," he wheezed, his scientific mind still analyzing, even as his body struggled to adapt. Nitrogen levels seem to have decreased, while carbon dioxide has likely increased. The greenhouse effect must be in full force, explaining the elevated temperatures despite the sun's reduced output. As he surveyed the beach, movement caught his eye. At first, he thought his oxygen-deprived brain was playing tricks on him. But no, there, scuttling across the sand, were creatures that defied description. They resembled enormous crabs, their chitinous bodies easily the size of a man. Their movements were jerky and alien, utterly unlike anything the time traveler had ever encountered. "Evolution has taken a strange turn," he muttered. Watching the creatures with a mixture of fascination and revulsion, these arthropods must have adapted to fill ecological niches left vacant by the extinction of mammals and other vertebrates. But what selective pressures could have led to such monstrous forms? The sight of these bizarre creatures, combined with the harsh alien landscape, filled the time traveler with a sense of abominable desolation. This was Earth, his home, but it had become as foreign and inhospitable as the most distant planet. Driven by a morbid curiosity to see how much further Earth's transformation would progress, the time traveler returned to his machine and pressed onward into the future. As he advanced through time, he witnessed the sun growing ever larger and duller. Its ruddy glow filled the sky, a constant reminder of the star's inexorable march towards its own demise. The Earth itself seemed to wither before his eyes. The last vestiges of plant life disappeared, leaving behind a barren landscape of rock and sand. The oceans, once teeming with life, became stagnant pools, their surfaces unbroken by any sign of movement. "The biomass of the planet has decreased to almost nothing," the time traveler observed, his voice barely a whisper in the thin air. "The complex web of life that once covered the Earth has been reduced to its simplest forms. Perhaps only extremophiles remain, clinging to existence in the most protected niches." As he pushed further into the future, the time traveler began to experience a bitter cold that seemed to seep into his very bones. Snowflakes materialized in the air around him, a stark contrast to the oppressive heat he had felt just moments, or was it millennia, earlier. "The Earth's climate is destabilizing," he realized, shivering despite the protection offered by his time machine. As the sun's output fluctuates in its death throes, the planet is experiencing wild swings in temperature. This snowfall could be the precursor to a new ice age. Suddenly, darkness began to fall. At first, the time traveler assumed it was simply another drawn-out night in this slowed-down version of Earth. But as the darkness deepened, becoming more absolute than any night he had ever experienced, he realized the truth. "An eclipse," he breathed, his eyes straining to make out any detail in the impenetrable blackness. But is it the moon, or perhaps some other celestial body? A wandering planet, maybe, captured by the sun's gravity as it expanded. The cold intensified, and the time traveler found himself gasping for breath in the rapidly thinning air. The stillness that descended was oppressive, unlike anything he had ever experienced. Gone were the familiar sounds of life, no bird calls, no rustle of wind through leaves, not even the lapping of waves on the shore. The silence was absolute, broken only by the pounding of his own heart. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, the time traveler peered out at the beach where he had stopped. There, moving with agonizing slowness in the dim light of distant stars, was a shape that defied comprehension. It seemed to be some sort of tentacled creature, its form fluid and ever-changing. Whether it was a product of Earth's final gasp of evolution or a visitor from some distant world, the time traveler couldn't say. The sight of this utterly alien being, combined with the crushing weight of millions of years of Earth's history, proved too much for the time traveler. He felt faint, his mind reeling from the implications of all he had witnessed. With trembling hands, he grasped the levers of his time machine. "I've seen enough," he muttered, his voice quavering. "It's time to return, to warn humanity of what awaits if we continue on our current path." As he prepared to reverse course, the time traveler found himself reflecting on the vast sweep of time he had just witnessed. In the span of what had felt like mere hours to him, he had seen the entire future history of the Earth play out. The rise and fall of civilizations, the slow death of the sun, the final whimper of life on the planet, all had unfolded before his eyes. "We humans," he mused, his fingers hovering over the controls, "we think ourselves the pinnacle of creation, the end result of billions of years of evolution. But in the grand cosmic scale, we are but a fleeting moment, a brief flicker of consciousness in the vast darkness of time." The enormity of what he had witnessed filled the time traveler with a profound sense of both insignificance and responsibility. Humanity's actions, he realized, could shape the course of the planet's future. The desolate wasteland he had just witnessed was not an inevitability, but a possible outcome that could perhaps be averted with the right knowledge and actions. With renewed determination, the time traveler activated his machine, setting course for his own era. As the familiar sensation of temporal displacement washed over him, he found himself struggling against waves of nausea and disorientation, far more intense than anything he had experienced before. "The human mind," he gasped, fighting to maintain consciousness, "is not equipped to process the kind of information I've just absorbed. The sheer scale of time, the profound changes to our world, it's almost too much to bear." As he hurtled back through the millennia, the time traveler's thoughts turned to the people of his own time. How could he convey to them the wonders and horrors he had witnessed? How could he impress upon them the urgent need to change course, to avoid the bleak future he had seen? The journey back seemed to stretch on for an eternity, each moment filled with the terrifying possibility that something might go wrong, that he might become lost in the vast ocean of time. But finally, mercifully, the wild oscillations of his machine began to slow. As familiar scenes from his own era began to materialize around him, the time traveler felt a surge of relief so intense it was almost painful. He had done it. He had journeyed to the very end of the Earth's history and returned to tell the tale. But even as he prepared to bring his machine to a final stop, the time traveler knew that his journey was far from over. The real challenge lay ahead, convincing a skeptical world of the truth of his experiences, and more importantly, inspiring action to change the course of human history. As the time machine settled into its familiar place in his laboratory, the time traveler took a deep, steadying breath. He had set out to explore the mysteries of time, but he had returned with something far more valuable: a vision of a possible future, and the knowledge needed to forge a different path. With trembling legs, he stepped down from the machine, his mind already racing with plans for how to share his discoveries. The weight of millions of years of Earth's future history rested on his shoulders, but along with it came a sense of purpose that filled him with renewed energy. "The future," he murmured to himself as he made his way towards the door, ready to face a world that had no idea how profoundly it had changed in his absence, "is not set in stone. We have the power to shape it, to learn from the mistakes of our potential descendants. And I, for one, intend to ensure that the twilight I witnessed never comes to pass." With that thought firmly in mind, the time traveler stepped out into the familiar surroundings of his own time, forever changed by his journey, but more determined than ever to make a difference in the world he called home. Chapter 15. The Return to the Present. The time traveler's consciousness flickered back to life, his senses slowly reasserting themselves as the kaleidoscopic blur of temporal displacement began to resolve into more recognizable patterns. He found himself still clinging to the controls of his time machine, his knuckles white with the strain of his grip, as the device hurtled backward through the vast expanse of time. As his faculties returned, the time traveler's analytical mind began to process the extraordinary sensory input bombarding him. The rapid succession of days and nights, which had slowed to a glacial pace in the far future, now accelerated to a dizzying flicker. The sun, once a bloated red giant hanging motionless in the sky, shrank and intensified, its color shifting from angry crimson to warm gold. "Fascinating," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the strange hum of the time machine. "I'm witnessing the reversal of stellar evolution in real time. The sun is contracting, its core reigniting, as helium fusion gives way to hydrogen. It's as if I'm watching the entire life cycle of a star played out in reverse." The sky above transformed from the oppressive alien red he had grown accustomed to in the far future, gradually lightening to a more familiar azure. The time traveler found himself marveling at the complex interplay of atmospheric gases and solar radiation that produced this comforting hue, a visual reminder of the delicate balance that made Earth habitable. As the machine continued its backward journey, the landscape began to shift and change at an ever-increasing pace. The barren, desolate wasteland of the far future gave way to lush vegetation, then to vast urban sprawls, and finally to more recognizable cityscapes. The time traveler's heart leapt as he began to recognize familiar architectural styles, each one a signpost marking his approach to his own era. "The progression of human architecture," he mused, "a physical manifestation of our species' technological and cultural evolution. From the simple shelters of our ancestors to the towering skyscrapers of the near future, each style tells a story of human ingenuity and adaptation." As the time machine slowed its frantic pace, the time traveler found himself approaching a moment of profound significance, his own departure point. He watched in fascination as the walls of his laboratory materialized around him, the familiar equipment and furnishings a welcome sight after the alien landscapes he had witnessed. Suddenly, a flicker of movement caught his eye. Mrs. Watchett, his housekeeper, appeared in the doorway, moving with an unnatural backward gait. The time traveler watched in amazement as she retreated across the room, her actions reversed as if in a film played backward. "Incredible," he breathed, his scientific mind racing to comprehend the implications of what he was witnessing. "I'm observing the reversal of entropy on a macroscopic scale. The arrow of time, which we've always assumed to be unidirectional, is being inverted before my very eyes." As Mrs. Watchett's reverse journey took her out of the laboratory, the time traveler felt a sudden jolt. The machine had come to a stop, its mechanisms falling silent for the first time in what felt like an eternity. For a moment, he sat motionless, his senses overwhelmed by the sudden cessation of movement and the familiar surroundings of his laboratory. Slowly, cautiously, he released his grip on the machine's controls and stepped onto the solid floor of his laboratory. The sensation of stability beneath his feet was almost shocking after the prolonged period of temporal displacement. He stumbled slightly, his legs unsteady, as he took in the scene around him. Everything was exactly as he had left it. The tools on his workbench lay undisturbed. The half-finished calculations on his chalkboard remained unchanged. It was as if the entire extraordinary journey had been nothing more than a vivid dream. But the time traveler knew better. His eyes fell on the time machine, noting its position relative to the room. With a start, he realized that the distance it had moved corresponded precisely to the journey from his lawn to the White Sphinx, in the world of the Eloi and Morlocks. "Physical displacement in the fourth dimension," he muttered, his mind grappling with the implications. The machine doesn't just move through time, but maintains its spatial coordinates relative to the Earth's surface. The ramifications for our understanding of space-time are staggering. As the full weight of his experiences began to settle upon him, the time traveler felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. His body, pushed to its limits by the rigors of time travel and his adventures in the future, cried out for rest. He became acutely aware of a sharp pain in his heel, a lingering reminder of his desperate struggles against the Morlocks. Limping slightly, he made his way out of the laboratory and towards the main house. As he entered, the familiar sights and sounds of his home washed over him like a balm. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, the soft rustle of curtains in the breeze from an open window. Each sensation grounded him firmly in the present. His eyes fell on a newspaper lying on a side table. With trembling hands he picked it up, confirming the date. It was the same day he had left, mere hours after his departure. The clock on the mantelpiece corroborated this, its hands indicating that dinner would soon be served. Einstein was right, the time traveler mused, a wry smile playing across his lips. Time is indeed relative. I've experienced millennia, witnessed the death of the earth and the sun, and yet here, barely an evening has passed. As if on cue, he heard the murmur of voices and the clinking of cutlery from the dining room. His friends, gathered for their weekly dinner, were blissfully unaware of the extraordinary journey he had undertaken. The normalcy of the scene struck him as almost comical in light of the cosmic drama he had just witnessed. For a moment, the time traveler hesitated at the threshold of the dining room. How could he possibly convey the magnitude of his experiences to his friends? How could he describe the wonders and horrors he had witnessed, the profound insights he had gained into the nature of time and the fate of humanity? But as he stood there, wrestling with these thoughts, he became acutely aware of his own physical state. His clothes were torn and stained, his body battered and bruised. The events of his journey were etched not just in his mind, but on his very person. With a deep breath, he stepped into the dining room. The conversation faltered as his friends turned to look at him, their expressions shifting from surprise to concern as they took in his disheveled appearance. "My dear fellow," exclaimed the medical man, rising from his seat, "what on earth has happened to you?" The time traveler managed a weak smile. "I'm afraid I've had quite an adventure," he said, his voice hoarse from disuse and the thin air of the far future. "But before I explain, might I trouble you for some soap and water? I find myself in desperate need of refreshment." As he was ushered to the washroom, the time traveler caught glimpses of his reflection in passing mirrors. He barely recognized the man staring back at him, his face gaunt and weathered, his eyes holding a depth of experience that seemed at odds with the mere hours that had passed in this timeline. The simple act of washing up became a profound experience. As he scrubbed the grime of millennia from his skin, the time traveler found himself marveling at the miracle of running water, the advanced plumbing systems that his contemporaries took for granted. He thought of the Eloi, with their decaying infrastructure, and of the barren wasteland of Earth's final days. "We stand at a crucial juncture," he murmured to his reflection. "The decisions we make now will shape the course of human history, potentially averting the future I've witnessed." Cleaned and somewhat refreshed, the time traveler rejoined his friends in the dining room. The table had been cleared, and his companions sat in expectant silence, their curiosity palpable. As he took his seat, a plate of food was placed before him, a simple meal that seemed like a feast after his ordeals. As he began to eat, savoring each bite with newfound appreciation, the time traveler felt the weight of his friends' gazes upon him. He knew the time had come to share his story, to attempt to convey the incredible journey he had undertaken. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice steady despite the tumult of emotions roiling within him, "I'm afraid you'll find my tale rather difficult to believe. Indeed, had I not experienced it myself, I would dismiss it as the ravings of a madman." He paused, gathering his thoughts, trying to find the words to encapsulate the vast sweep of time and experience he had undergone. "But I assure you," he continued, "every word I'm about to tell you is true. I have traveled through time, witnessed the fate of our species and our planet, and returned with knowledge that could change the course of human history." As he launched into his narrative, describing the world of the Eloi and the Morlocks, the time traveler observed the changing expressions on his friends' faces. Skepticism gave way to fascination, then to horror, as he recounted the grim fate that awaited humanity in that possible future. He spoke of the technological marvels he had encountered, explaining in detail the advanced materials and engineering principles that had allowed structures like the White Sphinx to endure for hundreds of thousands of years. He delved into the biological adaptations of the Eloi and Morlocks, speculating on the evolutionary pressures that had shaped their divergent forms. When he reached the part of his tale that described his journey to Earth's final days, the time traveler's voice grew hushed, filled with a sense of cosmic awe. He painted a vivid picture of the dying sun, the desolate landscape, and the strange tentacled creature he had glimpsed on that distant shore. "Gentlemen," he said, his eyes distant as he recalled the scene, "I stood witness to the twilight of our world. I saw the sun in its death throes, the earth a barren wasteland. And in those final moments, I understood the true scale of cosmic time, the insignificance of our brief moment in the universe's vast history." As he concluded his tale, describing his harrowing return journey and his relief at finding himself back in the present, a profound silence fell over the room. His friends sat motionless, their expressions a mixture of disbelief, wonder, and deep contemplation. The psychologist was the first to speak. "My dear fellow," he began, his voice gentle but skeptical, "you must understand how fantastic this all sounds. Surely you can't expect us to believe—" "I expect nothing," the time traveler interrupted, his voice firm. "I merely relate to you what I have experienced. Whether you choose to believe me or not is your own decision. But I implore you to consider the implications of what I've shared, regardless of its origin." He leaned forward, his eyes intense as he surveyed his friends. "We stand at a crossroads in human history. The future I witnessed is not inevitable. With the right choices, the right actions, we can shape a different path for our species." As the conversation that followed stretched into the night, the time traveler found himself filled with a renewed sense of purpose. He had embarked on his journey seeking knowledge, driven by scientific curiosity. But he had returned with something far more precious, a vision of potential futures, both wondrous and terrible, and the understanding that humanity's destiny lay in its own hands. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows, the time traveler excused himself from his still debating friends. He made his way back to his laboratory, drawn by an irresistible urge to see his time machine once more. As he stood before the device that had carried him across the vast expanse of time, the time traveler felt a mix of emotions wash over him. Pride in his creation, wonder at the vistas it had shown him, and a deep sense of responsibility for the knowledge he now possessed. "The future is not set," he murmured, running his hand along the cool metal of the machine. "And with this, we have the power to explore it, to learn from it, and perhaps to change it." With that thought, the time traveler turned away from his invention, his mind already racing with plans for how to use his newfound knowledge. The sun was rising on a new day, and with it, the promise of a future that was still to be written. 16. The Vanishing Point. As the time traveler's extraordinary tale drew to a close, a profound silence fell over the room. The assembled guests sat motionless, their expressions a mixture of wonder, skepticism, and disbelief. The cosmic implications of the journey just described hung heavy in the air, challenging the very foundations of their understanding of reality. The time traveler himself seemed momentarily overwhelmed by the magnitude of his own story. He ran a hand through his disheveled hair, his eyes distant as if still seeing the dying sun of Earth's far future. I scarcely believe it myself," he admitted, his voice hoarse from the hours of narration, "and yet, every word I've spoken is true. I've witnessed the twilight of our world, seen the final gasps of life on this planet we call home. I've glimpsed a future that fills me with both wonder and dread." He turned to face his audience, his gaze intense. "I invite your skepticism, gentlemen. Indeed, I would be concerned if you accepted my tale without question. The implications of time travel, the paradoxes it presents, the sheer scale of temporal displacement, these concepts challenge our very understanding of the universe." The editor was the first to break the silence that followed. "My dear fellow," he began, his tone a mixture of amusement and condescension, "you spin a marvelous tale. Truly, you have a gift for narrative. But surely you don't expect us to believe that this flight of fancy is anything more than an elaborate jest." The time traveler's response was calm, measured. "I expect nothing, my friend. I merely relate what I have experienced. Whether you choose to believe me or not is entirely your prerogative." The medical man leaned forward, his brow furrowed in concentration. The physical toll of such a journey. If what you say is true, it should have left some evidence on your person. Do you have any tangible proof of your extraordinary claims? A small smile played across the time traveler's lips. He reached into his pocket and produced a handful of strange white flowers, their delicate petals unlike anything the assembled guests had ever seen. These, he said softly, I plucked from the garden of the Eloi. Notice their structure, the unique adaptations that speak of an environment far removed from our own. The enlarged chloroplasts, the modified stomata, all indicators of a plant evolved to thrive in the altered atmospheric conditions of Earth's distant future. He then rolled up his sleeve, revealing a series of angry red scars that crisscrossed his arm. And these, he continued, his voice tinged with a mixture of pride and pain, are souvenirs of my encounters with the Morlocks. Observe the unusual pattern of the wounds, the depth of the lacerations. They correspond precisely to the dentition and claw structure I described in those future predators. The psychologist examined the scars closely, his professional curiosity piqued. Fascinating, he murmured. The tissue shows signs of accelerated healing, consistent with exposure to an environment with elevated oxygen levels. And the scarring pattern is indeed unlike anything I've encountered in my medical studies. For a moment, even the time traveler seemed to waver, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. There are times, he admitted, when I question my own sanity. The enormity of what I've witnessed, the vast sweep of time I've traversed, it strains the limits of human comprehension. He stood abruptly, his sudden movement startling his guests. But come, he said, a new energy infusing his voice, let me show you the instrument of my journey. Perhaps the time machine itself will convince you where my words have failed. The group followed the time traveler to his laboratory, a space that seemed to hum with barely contained energy. And there, in the center of the room, stood the time machine. Its brass and ivory components gleamed in the lamplight, but closer inspection revealed signs of wear and damage consistent with the harrowing journey its creator had described. The time traveler ran his hand lovingly over the machine's control panel. Observe, he said, his voice filled with a mixture of pride and awe. The chronometric dials still register the vast temporal distance we traversed. And here, see the scorch marks from our narrow escape from the Morlock's underground lair. The very fabric of the machine bears witness to the truth of my tale. The guests crowded around the device, their skepticism warring with the undeniable physical evidence before them. The engineer examined the machine's components with professional interest, marveling at the intricate interplay of gears and levers that somehow allowed for movement through the fourth dimension. The theoretical implications are staggering, he muttered, more to himself than to the group. The energy requirements alone for such temporal displacement and the mechanics of maintaining coherence across vast stretches of time. It defies our current understanding of physics. As the night wore on and the discussion continued, the time traveler found himself fielding an endless barrage of questions. He explained, with patience and precision, the intricacies of chronal displacement, the relativistic effects he had observed, and the profound implications his journey held for humanity's understanding of time and space. We stand, he said, his voice resonating with the weight of his experiences, at the threshold of a new era in human knowledge. The ability to traverse time opens up possibilities we can scarcely imagine. We can witness the birth of stars, the formation of galaxies, the very origins of our universe. But with this power comes great responsibility. The future I witnessed is not inevitable. Armed with this knowledge, we have the opportunity, nay, the obligation, to shape a different path for our species. As dawn broke and the guests finally took their leave, each lost in thought about the extraordinary tale they had heard, the time traveler retreated to his study. He sat at his desk, surrounded by the familiar trappings of his life. Books, scientific instruments, half-finished calculations scrawled on scraps of paper. And yet he felt profoundly changed, as if he no longer quite belonged in this time and place. The following day, as afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows of the time traveler's home, the narrator returned. He found his friend in the laboratory, bustling about with an energy that belied the exhaustion of the previous night's tale. "Ah, there you are," the time traveler exclaimed, looking up from a jumble of equipment he was packing into a small case. "I was hoping you'd return. I'm preparing for another journey, you see, a chance to gather more evidence, to explore even further into the mysteries of time." The narrator regarded his friend with a mixture of concern and fascination. "Another journey? But surely, after all you've been through, you need rest. Time to process your experiences." The time traveler's eyes gleamed with an almost feverish light. "Rest? My dear fellow, how can I rest? When the entire tapestry of time lies open before me, there's so much to learn, so much to discover. The fate of humanity itself may hang in the balance of what I uncover." He patted the time machine affectionately. "This time, I'll be better prepared. I'm taking a camera, specimen jars, proper scientific instruments. When I return, I'll have incontrovertible proof of my travels. Photographs of the future Earth, samples of its altered flora and fauna, perhaps even artifacts from the civilizations that rise and fall in the intervening years." The narrator found himself both impressed and slightly unnerved by his friend's enthusiasm. "But the dangers you faced, the Morlocks, the dying Earth, are you certain it's wise to risk such perils again?" The time traveler's expression softened. "My friend, the pursuit of knowledge always carries risks, but consider the potential benefits. With the insights I gain, we might be able to alter the course of human history to steer our species away from the grim future I witnessed. Is that not worth any personal danger I might face?" As they continued to talk, the time traveler outlining his plans and theories, the narrator found himself swept up in the excitement of the moment. The possibilities seemed endless, the potential for discovery limitless. And yet a nagging sense of unease persisted, a feeling that something momentous and perhaps irreversible was about to occur. "Well," the narrator said at last, rising to take his leave, "I wish you the very best of luck on your journey. I look forward to hearing of your adventures upon your return." The time traveler clasped his hand warmly. "Thank you, my friend. Your support means more than you know. And don't worry, I'll be back before you know it, with wonders beyond imagining to share." As the narrator made his way to the door, he heard a sudden commotion from the laboratory. The hum of machinery, a strange whooshing sound, and then silence. Alarmed, he rushed back, bursting through the door with his heart pounding. The laboratory was empty. The time machine was gone. And with it, the time traveler himself had vanished. For a long moment, the narrator stood motionless, struggling to process what had just occurred. The air in the room seemed charged with residual energy, the faintest scent of ozone lingering as the only evidence of the extraordinary event that had taken place. As the reality of the situation sank in, the narrator was overwhelmed by a profound sense of loss. Not just the loss of a friend, but the loss of the incredible potential that the time traveler's discoveries had represented. The secrets of time itself, the key to unlocking the mysteries of the universe, all had disappeared in the blink of an eye. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and still the time traveler did not return. The narrator found himself haunting the laboratory, half expecting to hear the familiar hum of the time machine materializing at any moment. But the room remained stubbornly, oppressively empty. As time passed, the narrator wrestled with conflicting emotions, hope that his friend would one day return, bringing with him new wonders and insights from the far reaches of time. Fear that some catastrophe had befallen him, leaving him stranded in a hostile future or lost in the vast expanse of history. And a growing, gnawing doubt, had it all been real? Or had he, too, been caught up in an elaborate delusion? But in his heart, the narrator knew the truth. He had seen the wonder in the time traveler's eyes, had felt the weight of the knowledge his friend had gained. Whatever had happened, wherever or whenever the time traveler now was, the experience had been real. As he stood in the empty laboratory one final time, preparing to leave and perhaps never return, the narrator found himself reflecting on the profound implications of his friend's journey. The time traveler had opened a door to the infinite possibilities of time and space, had glimpsed the vast sweep of Earth's history and humanity's potential futures. And though the man himself was gone, the impact of his discoveries remained. The questions he had raised, the vistas he had described, the warnings he had issued about humanity's possible fate, all of these lingered, challenging those who had heard his tale to think differently about their place in the cosmos. As he turned to leave, the narrator's gaze fell upon a small white flower, one of those the time traveler had brought back from the future. It lay forgotten on a dusty workbench, its delicate petals still vibrant despite the passage of time. Gently, reverently, the narrator picked up the flower. In that moment, holding this tiny piece of a possible future, he made a silent vow. He would keep the time traveler's story alive, would share the wonders and warnings his friend had brought back from his extraordinary journey. For in doing so, perhaps humanity might yet chart a course towards a brighter future than the one the time traveler had witnessed. With a deep breath, the narrator stepped out of the laboratory, closing the door behind him. The time traveler was gone, vanished into the vast unknown of time itself. But his legacy, the profound questions he had raised about humanity's place in the universe and its responsibility to shape its own destiny, would endure. And in that legacy lay the seeds of hope for a future yet unwritten, waiting to be explored by those brave enough to follow in the time traveler's footsteps. As the days stretched into weeks and the weeks into months, I found myself increasingly preoccupied with thoughts of the time traveler's fate. The laboratory, once a hub of frenetic activity and mind-bending discoveries, now stood silent and empty, a monument to the extraordinary journey that had reshaped my understanding of the universe. Sitting in my study, surrounded by books on physics, paleontology, and futurism, my mind wandered across the vast expanse of time, contemplating the myriad possibilities that lay before my friend. The time machine, that miraculous device that had torn a hole in the fabric of space-time, could have carried its inventor to any point in Earth's long and tumultuous history. Perhaps, I mused aloud, my voice barely above a whisper, he has journeyed into the distant past to witness the dawn of humanity itself. In my mind's eye, I saw the time traveler materializing on a windswept plain, the air thick with the scent of wild grasses and wood smoke. Early humans, their bodies lean and wiry from the constant struggle for survival, gathered around the strange contraption, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and curiosity. I imagined my friend attempting to communicate with these ancestors, bridging a gap of hundreds of thousands of years with gestures and simple sounds. What insights might he gain, I wondered, from observing the birth of human consciousness, the first flickerings of the intellect that would one day unlock the secrets of the cosmos? But the past held more than just the story of humanity. The Earth's history stretched back billions of years, a vast canvas of evolutionary drama and geological upheaval. My imagination took flight, conjuring visions of the time traveler, witnessing scenes from Earth's distant past. I saw the time machine hovering above the vast expanse of the Cretaceous Sea, its brass and ivory components gleaming in the ancient sunlight. Below, the dark shapes of mosasaurs and plesiosaurs cut through the water, their powerful bodies propelling them in pursuit of prey. The air was filled with the cries of pterosaurs, their leathery wings casting shadows across the waves. The atmospheric composition would be markedly different, I murmured, my scientific mind engaging with the fantasy. Higher oxygen levels, perhaps around 30%, compared to our current 21%. The implications for biodiversity, for the sheer scale of life forms, it's staggering to contemplate. The scene in my mind shifted, and now I saw the time traveler standing on a Jurassic plain, dwarfed by the towering forms of sauropods. Their long necks stretched towards the canopy of primitive conifers and cycads, while in the underbrush the lithe forms of early mammals scurried about, unaware of the dominant role their descendants would one day play. The interplay of ecosystems, the delicate balance of predator and prey, and all of it shaped by the inexorable forces of natural selection. To witness it firsthand, to see the raw data of evolution unfolding before one's eyes. What a gift that would be to science. But my imagination wasn't content to stop there. It pushed further back, to even more alien landscapes from Earth's distant past. I envisioned the time traveler exploring the vibrant underwater worlds of the Ulitic coral reefs, marveling at the diversity of marine life that thrived in those ancient seas. Or perhaps he had ventured to the shores of the Triassic's great saline seas, witnessing the first tentative steps of reptiles onto land, setting in motion the great evolutionary journey that would eventually lead to the dinosaurs and, ultimately, to humanity itself. Each era, I reflected, a snapshot in the grand tapestry of life on Earth. Each moment pregnant with the potential of what was to come, yet utterly unaware of its place in the greater narrative of evolution. But even as these visions of the past danced through my mind, I couldn't help but consider the other possibility, that the time traveler had once again journeyed into the future. Despite the horrors he had witnessed in the world of the Eloi and the Morlocks, might not the allure of seeing even further into humanity's potential future prove irresistible? My imagination shifted gears, conjuring images of advanced civilizations that had solved the problems plaguing modern society. I saw gleaming cities powered by clean, limitless energy, their spires reaching towards the stars. In my mind's eye, I witnessed humanity spreading out across the solar system, terraforming Mars, establishing colonies on the moons of Jupiter and Saturn. Imagine, I said softly, a future where we've harnessed the power of fusion, where we've unlocked the secrets of gravity itself, a world where disease and hunger are distant memories, where the combined intellect of humanity is focused on pushing the boundaries of knowledge ever further. Yet even as I painted these optimistic pictures, I couldn't help but remember the time traveler's more pessimistic outlook. My friend had seen a future where humanity had diverged, where technological progress had led not to utopia, but to a nightmarish world of predator and prey. But surely, I argued to the empty room, that's not the only possible outcome. The future isn't set in stone. Armed with the knowledge of that potential fate, couldn't we chart a different course? I thought of the rapid advancements in science and technology that were already reshaping the world. The harnessing of electricity, the development of new modes of transportation, the beginnings of powered flight. Each breakthrough opened up new possibilities, new avenues for human progress. Perhaps, I mused, the time traveler has gone even further, beyond the twilight of Earth that he described. What wonders might exist in those distant epochs? Might humanity have transcended its physical form, becoming beings of pure energy or consciousness? Could we have unlocked the secrets of faster-than-light travel, spreading across the galaxy or even to other dimensions? The possibilities seemed endless, limited only by the bounds of imagination and the as-yet undiscovered laws of physics. And yet I knew that the future remained largely a mystery, a vast unknown that could hold wonders beyond imagining or terrors that defied description. As my mind grappled with these cosmic possibilities, my gaze fell upon a small glass case on my desk. Within it lay two withered white flowers, the last tangible evidence of the time traveler's extraordinary journey. These delicate blooms, plucked from the garden of the Eloi, had survived across an unimaginable gulf of time to reach the present day. I gently opened the case, inhaling the faint, alien scent that still clung to the flowers. In that moment, I was struck by a profound realization. Whatever the future might hold, whatever strange turns human evolution might take, there were some qualities that seemed to endure across the vast expanse of time. Gratitude and tenderness, these simple yet profound emotions, had survived in the Eloi, despite the incredible changes their species had undergone. They were qualities that the time traveler had recognized, had connected with despite the vast gulf of years that separated them. Perhaps, I said softly, cradling the delicate flowers in my palm, these are the true constants of human nature. Not our technology, not our physical form, but our capacity for kindness, for empathy, for connection. And I thought of the time traveler's interactions with Weena, the bond that had formed between them despite their vastly different origins. It was a testament to the enduring power of human compassion, a bridge across time itself. As I carefully replaced the flowers in their case, I felt a renewed sense of hope for the future. Yes, there were potential dangers ahead, pitfalls that humanity would need to navigate carefully. But there was also the possibility of greatness, of achievements beyond imagining. The time traveler's journey, his incredible tale of future worlds and the fate of humanity, had forever altered my perspective. No longer could I look at the present without considering its place in the vast sweep of time, its role in shaping the countless possible futures that lay ahead. We stand, I murmured, at a crossroads in human history. Our actions today, our choices and our values, will echo across the ages, shaping the world that is to come. I thought of the responsibility this knowledge placed on our shoulders. Armed with a glimpse of possible futures, we had the opportunity, perhaps even the obligation, to steer humanity towards a brighter path. As night fell and the stars began to emerge, twinkling in the velvet sky, I found myself drawn to the window. I gazed up at the cosmic tapestry above, each point of light a sun not unlike our own, possibly surrounded by worlds teeming with life and possibilities. "Where are you now, my friend?" I whispered to the stars. "What wonders are you witnessing? What secrets of time and space have you uncovered?" Though I knew I might never see the time traveler again, never learn the ultimate fate of my extraordinary friend, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey we had shared. The time machine might be gone, its inventor lost in the vast expanse of time, but the impact of our adventure would resonate for years to come. As I turned away from the window, my eyes fell upon my writing desk, where a half-finished manuscript lay waiting. I had begun to record the time traveler's tale, to preserve this incredible story for future generations. It was, I realized, both a tribute to my friend and a warning to humanity, a reminder of the potential futures that awaited and the power we held to shape our own destiny. With renewed purpose, I sat down at the desk and picked up my pen. The story of the time traveler I knew was far from over. It would continue to unfold in the imagination of all who heard it, inspiring generations to come to look at their world with new eyes, to consider their place in the vast tapestry of time. As I began to write, I felt a profound sense of connection to the past, to the future, and to the enduring spirit of human curiosity that drove us to explore the unknown. Whatever lay ahead, whatever strange turns the path of human history might take, that spirit would endure, a beacon of hope shining across the infinite expanse of time.
You've just experienced H.G. Wells's groundbreaking novel, The Time Machine. We hope this journey through time has sparked your imagination and left you pondering the possibilities of the future. We'd like to thank you for choosing to spend your time with us, exploring this classic work of science fiction. Your support allows us to continue bringing timeless literature to life through audio. If you enjoyed this audiobook, we kindly ask for your support on our YouTube channel. Please consider liking this video, subscribing to our channel, and hitting the notification bell to stay updated on our latest releases. Your engagement helps us reach more listeners and produce more quality content.
Don't forget to leave a comment sharing your thoughts on the time machine. What did you think of Wells' vision of the future? How do you think it relates to our world today?
Thank you again for listening. Until our next literary adventure, keep your mind open to the wonders of both past and future.